can be the very accredited entities that submitted the program in the first place. It's very important to note that the fund considers the countries as the beneficiaries, as its beneficiaries, and therefore we work throughout the process with the national designated authorities, the NDAs, and these are the focal points for the GCF in each country. The financial instruments of the GCF, usually people think only grants, but there are also loans, guarantees, and equity. So usually one of the questions that you have to answer when you submit a proposal is, why did you choose this financial instrument and not another one? Another one means usually loans or guarantees or something that doesn't have full concessionality. In terms of the resources, there are 10.1 billion in signed contributions, so that's what we usually consider. The aim is to have 50% into mitigation and 50% of adaptation. Of the 50% in adaptation, 50% should go to SIDS, LDCs, and Africa. So that's about 25% of the GCF resources. It also aims for geographical balance. There's also 80 million approximately for readiness support and 40 million for project preparation. So this is just to give you an idea of the amounts we're talking about here. In terms of result areas of the fund, as I mentioned, we have mitigation and adaptation, and the fund seeks innovative, sustainable, high impact potential proposals in these two areas. In mitigation, we have energy generation and access, transport, building cities, industries, and appliances, and forests and land use. So these mitigation projects, they're usually aimed at reducing emissions. These projects usually generate income, and therefore you have to have a very good justification if you want a grant in them. You can have also different types of crowding in of private resources, for example. In adaptation, the result areas are health, food, and water security, livelihoods of people and communities, infrastructure and built environment, and ecosystems and ecosystem services. Each project that's submitted to the GCF is evaluated on 6 investment criteria. The first being the impact potential, which is what is the impact in terms of tons of carbon equivalent mitigated and number of benefits. The paradigm shift potential, how will this project impact the country beyond a one-off project? Potential, which is the economic, ecological, social, and gender co-benefits of the proposal. Country ownership, so is this a project that really is being led by the country? Efficiency and effectiveness, is this a good idea from an economic perspective? And finally, does this respond to the needs of the recipients? Meaning, we usually expect consultations with affected parties. To give you an idea, there is no country allocation in GCF, so usually when we look at the projects, we look at whether this is a good project in a specific area, and you're competing with all the other projects that are being submitted. As I said before, SIDS and LDCs and African states do have a priority. So in terms of getting ready, so that's the readiness and preparatory support finance. We have funding capped at 1 million per country per year for the strengthening of the national designated authorities, the supporting strategic frameworks, and supporting the direct access entities. And we also have adaptation planning processes capped at 3 million per country. So these are funds that are approved by the Secretariat itself. They don't go to the board, so the process is usually a little bit quicker. In terms of the step in the process for this readiness funds, first you develop the proposal, you submit, it's reviewed, finally it's approved, then you go through the legal arrangements and the disbursement and implementation per se. Now, in terms of what have we already approved in the readiness program? We have 124 proposals covering 88 countries for 39.5 million. So in Latin America and the Caribbean, there are 34 approved and 19 dispersed. I know that lumping up Caribbean with Latin America sometimes gives distorted view, but okay, sorry. So here you have the adaptation planning process, and there are the country names, so you don't have to be lumped up with anyone. There are 35 proposals submitted, 14 from LDCs, 3 from SIDS, 8 have been approved. The ones that are underlined are the approved ones. 7 being resubmitted, and 27 of these 35 proposals have 2 delivery partners. So we do welcome submissions by other organizations. In terms of the GCF private sector facility, these are projects aimed for the private sector, and this is really just one slide to give you a very short idea on this. The idea is that climate change needs the help of the private sector to implement mitigation and adaptation actions. In terms of possible interventions, the fund does provide loans, as I said, but it also aims to reduce the risk of investment. So if a private sector wants to invest in a business idea that is climate friendly or increases resilience, for example, the fund aims to reduce the risk to actually make that proposition of interest to the private sector. And the access is, again, through accredited entities, but these accredited entities are usually with private sector operations. So while IDB and IFC are some examples, there are also private banks that have been accredited. In terms of the portfolio of the full funding proposals now, I must say there was a board meeting 10 days ago, and these slides have not been updated. But we now have about 2.5 billion projects for 54 projects approved. And these are the countries that have projects approved. So as you can see, there's only one from the Eastern Caribbean. That's a private sector IDB project approved in this region. In terms of portfolio composition by region, again, I'm sorry, you're lumped in Latin America and the Caribbean, but you saw there's only one project from the Caribbean, so it's mostly Latin America. In terms of window, 27% adaptation, 41% mitigation, and 32% cross-cutting, which means a project has declared it has both mitigation and adaptation benefits. In terms of instrument, 39% grants, 42% grants, 39% loans, 18% equity. So that's the 3 major instruments. And of the 2.2 billion that the GCF has financed, it has brought in 5.1 billion in co-financing. So as you can see, when submitting a project. In terms of the estimated impact of these projects, once they have been implemented, mitigation impacts amount to about 981 million tons of carbon equivalent, and the adaptation benefits 125 million beneficiaries. So how do you actually submit a proposal to the GCF? The idea is that you have accredited entities and national designated authorities come up with an idea. This idea is then put into a concept note. The concept note for template has just been revised and simplified, so 2 weeks ago, sort of. So it's now up to 12 pages, and the amount of detail requested has been reduced. This is also when you can request project preparatory facility funding, so it's the PPF we call it, which can help you prepare projects or consultancies or reports needed to justify your full proposal. After the concept note, you prepare the funding proposal itself, you submit it, you get comments, you resubmit. Then it goes to the board decision, and finally the legal arrangement and the implementation. So accredited entities can submit projects and programs for funding, and they are evaluated against the fund's investment criteria, as I just mentioned. And the NDAs and focal points of each country can also submit concept notes directly. What is expected in a funding proposal? So this is the full project. After you've gone through the concept note stage, you need a non-objection from the country national designated authority. You need a full feasibility study saying that whatever you are proposing makes sense from a technical point of view. And that's where we need a lot of the science and technical studies to give feedback into these proposals. For example, water is a big issue in the Caribbean. You have projects that want to move wells from one point to another point to make them farther from the coast. Is that feasible? What's the water table balance? What's the viability in the medium term of those proposals? That's the types of questions that the fund asks, and most of the accredited entities take a lot of time to find the answers needed. You also need a procurement plan and a budget breakdown. How are you going to use the funding from the GCF? You need an environmental and social impact assessment. Depending on how risky from an environmental and social safeguards point of view your project is, the more stringent the assessment has to be. Gender assessment and analysis, a risk assessment, a logic framework with midterm and final milestones, and stakeholder consultations. So as you can see, it's a lot of stuff, and the basic idea is that the GCF wants projects that are ready to start up and running the day after they're signed. So that requires engineering studies, that requires, as I said, good feasibility studies to be able to get to that point. To give you an idea of the approval process, we have in the top rectangle the roles of the accredited entity, so that's the upper line, the secretariat, the middle line, that's where I sit, and then the board. So you have a generation of funding proposals from the accredited entity or the NDA. Those are developed into a concept notes, which one note, the concept notes are voluntary. However, we encourage the submission of the concept notes in the sense that in the concept notes you can get feedback on your idea before you actually go prepare a full funding proposal and hire all those consultants to do the feasibility study without knowing what the GCF thinks or how it fits the GCF investment criteria and analysis. So after that, you actually submit the funding proposal, taking into consideration the feedback you got from the concept note. This requires a non-objection from the NDA. Then the Secretariat does the second level due diligence. The idea here is that the accredited entities do the first level due diligence and we do the second level due diligence. There's also a technical advisory panel that is constituted of independent body that also gives comments on the funding proposal, and then finally they go to the board. So, and then the legal arrangements are implemented with everyone on board, both from the technical side, from the Secretariat, but also the accredited entity and obviously the executing entities as well. So what happens when we get a funding proposal? First, we check if it is complete. Does it have all the mandatory annexes? Does it have a feasibility study? Does it have, is the template complete? If it's not, we return it, unfortunately, because we don't have the capacity to analyze everything that we get. So the second stage is everything's complete, we review it. You get comments by performance against investment criteria and the consistency with the GCF safeguards and policies. The third stage is the independent technical advisory panel assessment, and that's specific to the investment criteria. And finally, we submit the package to the board. This makes it seem very linear, but usually there's a back and forth, significant back and forth with the accredited entities in these processes. In terms of gender, just to highlight some things, 84% of the approved funding proposals contained a gender assessment, so the GCF is really trying to mainstream gender into all projects. 67 contained a gender level social and project level gender and social inclusion action plan. We also want to embed gender in readiness in the National Adaptation Program and the PPF. So don't think about gender only in the funding proposal, think of it throughout. And I think that's it for now. I think it's worthwhile to leave some time for questions, but thank you very much.
A few announcements here. First of all, I would like to recognize the presence of His Excellency David Bradsford. He's from the the High Commissioner of Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you so much for being here, sir. Also, I'd like to recognize the presence of the ambassador from Belize. If I recall correctly, the ambassador from Belize, she was here this morning. She actually asked a question, maybe she left. Oh, thank you so much. So she's back there, probably thinking about it. So thanks again. I think that's it. I'm not missing anyone else. For the sake of actually exploiting in a good way, exploiting our resources to leave in 10 minutes, the representative from GCF has to go back to the hotel. I will open the floor for 3-4 questions. I think it's very important. We have a chance to ask any sort of question. Very close. So please, the floor is yours. I take any questions. Microphone. Yes, over there.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Jamaica. I wanted to find out if you could give us a general sense of the length of the process from the time, under normal circumstances, from the time that. Can you see roughly, and what are typically blocks that would prevent a more
very significant depending on how complete is your proposal of all the justification for what you want to do and you do and when. The second is the technical justification. You have the technical input justify what you're doing. Given those two, I'd say 18 months. If you have a good proposal that will fly, or I mean you will, but if the comments are more in terms of answering questions that you have the answer, I'd say it's about 18 years.
Thank you. Yes, please go ahead.
Question. The territory region, St. Martin, Anguilla, British Virgin Islands, badly hit in the last few weeks. Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Maria. There are concerns about whether access to fund either directly of a regional project or as part of a private project. And it seems gray area. I don't seem to get any response from the government. Is there any claim on the Green Climate Fund as the Green Climate Fund financing?
It's a very good question and one that is still in the gray area, so I am unfortunately not qualified to answer that.
Is it possible you could find out and respond on that matter?
Yes, I can.
I guess we will get your presentation. And can we get this presentation? Yeah? And your email? Good. Thank you. Take another question on the floor. If there are any questions, that's our chance to we can bridge policy and science. Yes, yes. The gentleman. Yes, yes. Thank you.
Two simple questions. Is there help that could assist us in ensuring that when we put something down paper, using your words, it appears to me that there's a serious proposal. Let me put it bluntly, getting everything. And I have a problem with that. So I'm asking, I suspect whether there is a help desk or not. Should speaking here, you get all the interventions that seem to get involved proactively. Challenge because of the knowledge base, and therefore we need to assist in a way that will assist us in a thing. I want to ask, how, for example, you mentioned it was the particular state you would give the didn't said. Agent like the CIA apply to be an agent to access who in the region.
Thank you very much for your questions. On what type of help can you get to support countries in preparing proposals, that's precisely why I'm here this week. The Caribbean Development Bank is hosting a workshop with countries to prepare notes, and a lot of the discussion, this is the third day, is the closing day, has been how do you tailor projects to the because it is a different, I mean, a lot of time, I mean, we've been talking for decades, but development is different from climate change adaptation, for example. That way, if you submit a development proposal, you will get very harsh comments from CF. So how do you look at it from a climate change adaptation perspective? That has been the core of what we've been discussing. And with the aim of increasing capacities in the regions and in the countries for this. It's also one of the first type of trainings that the GCF has been doing with regions. There was one in Africa last week as well. So there is no help desk. There's a country programming division, countries at gcfund.org. You can answer. Usually the has two main within itself. One is country program division, which works with engaging countries. I work for the mitigation and adaptation, which is the technical side, which reviews the proposals and reviews the concept notes and all that. So if you're looking for help, it should be with the country programming division. And in terms of the second question, just remind me on the topic. Sorry.
Can we have a microphone there, please? Please. Back there. Coming.
Oh, the readiness. Oh. Yes, I remember. The readiness funds can be accessed by institutions that are defined by the National Designated Authority as the institution of choice for these for using these funds. So they can be accredited entities to the fund. To be honest, that makes the process simpler, but it can also be entities that are not yet accredited, but they have to go through an additional questionnaire to assess their financial procurement processes, for example.
Okay, I take two more questions. One is Iris over there, and then Dr. Trotz afterwards. Please go ahead.
No, thank you very much. I would like to respond to you as well as that the FAO
Be
became
close to the microphone so
sorry.
we can...
So I would like to respond to you is that the FAO became an accredited entity last year, October 2016. So when it comes to GCF Concept Now is preparing project on the aquaculture sector in the Caribbean, we also provide support in terms of readiness and developing project proposals. So when it comes to the aquaculture sector, you can also turn to the FAO for support on that.
Thank you. Please, Dr. Trotz.
Yeah, I'm very interested in a statement you just made about development and climate change being different. I'm concerned about the context. In the Caribbean, after the last two events, we have countries that have been wiped out. Dominica, for instance. So the question is, at what stage of the whole rehabilitation process for Dominica would actions under that rehabilitation be eligible for adaptation funds?
So what I can tell you, and not being precise here is mostly due to there not being definitions at the GCF itself. So it's the idea is that the GCF will cover additional costs of climate change in terms of building resilience. So it's not so much reconstruction as it is increasing resilience to minimize damages in the future. That's one thing. The other thing is that if you are building something and you have an additional cost of adaptation, that is what the GCF would like to cover.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Okay, I'm sure we can discuss this for the next 2 hours. Before I let the representative from GCF go, I have a question myself, since I'm in this great position. In case of, I understand you require lots of, not a lot, like you solid background, a decision if it's on the inset of ocean acidification, so decrease of pH, which will, will affect the corals and all sorts of fishing dynamics like nursing, and can also affect in a way tourism. Studies are not done at the global level, but local is very difficult, even though it is a climate threat. So, what will be the sweet midway to actually have approval from the GCF that is a threat? That would be an additional threat that has to be dealt with, even though unfortunately the scientific knowledge is not as advanced, because otherwise you will require more scientific knowledge, which will require more money, which will require, so that's trying to get how you make a decision under such uncertainty. If it's possible, if it's not considered at all, that would be great.
It's a tricky situation because you rely on references. So say that country X is threatened by climate change according to these X, Y, Z, A, B, C, and all that, we believe you. Okay, so basically...
So publish.
Yes,
start
exactly.
publishing.
The main is that it's on the science community to tell us are the impacts of climate change. So what that will have the best outcomes. So.
For Simon Barge for being here, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Your time, and thanks for the presentation. I'm sure we'll be in touch. Thanks again. So now, moving on, in the context of different regional international partners that might support, and they are been supporting climate action and climate programs in the region, I would like to introduce to the podium, you already met her this morning, Mrs. Tani Bello from the European Union Director General for Development and Cooperation, which she will entertain us about the EU and some of the initiatives, including GCA+. Please, you are.
Okay, give me the time. So, well, thank you also, honorable ambassadors who are here today, and welcome to the discussions that we were having here. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I represent here the Directorate General for International Cooperation and Development. I'm personally the overall manager and coordinator of the Global Climate Change Alliance Plus initiative. So I'm here today, and this presentation I will not go into the details of the GCCA Plus initiative and how it works and how to get access to the funding, but I will give you an overview of what we do together with you in the region and what has been the EU climate action for the Caribbean to build resilience. So, well, first of all, our support, maybe, here you go. So just to remind you about, as I said, the work we do in the framework of the development cooperation, the primary objective of the DG DEFCO, so the Director General of the European Commission that I represent here today, is poverty eradication, so for sustainable development. And this, I'd like to remind you about this because of the discussions that we had also in the last few days, where when we talk about climate change, it is very important to stress the relevance of integrating environmental and climate change issues for sustainable development. So the EU is supporting the, countries across the world, but in particular SEEDS and LDCs. And here as SEEDS, I'd like just to share what we are doing. In terms of global agenda, we know all that since 2015 we have a set of new global objectives. The policy frameworks that are behind our action are the 2030 Sustainable Development, the Agenda for Sustainable Development, the new European Consensus that was adopted by the Council last June, the SEEDS Accelerated Modalities of Action, the Samoa Pathway, the Paris Agreement, climate change, the Sendai Framework, and let's not forget about the work that we are doing, and the EU is also putting as a priority in the Development Cooperation Agenda, which deals with ocean governance and ocean issues. So, as I said, we all are aware, I'd like to stress it again today, we help the most vulnerable to cope. SEEDS belong to this group of most vulnerables because of a number of reasons, including the topic of today, climate change. We provide a number of instruments in support. Some of them are under the Development Cooperation Instrument, other are the European Development Fund instrument, and we use a number of implementation modalities and like loans, grants, and joint programming and blending. All this together with you with the aim of ensuring aid effectiveness. So what we do at the global level in terms of funding and climate action is the European Union is committed to put 20% of its budget into climate action for the period 2014-2020. And what that means in figures is like 14 billion euros for the period, and will be availed to developing countries. And an amount of 2.5 billion will be dedicated to actually blending. So again, this can connect to different ways of accessing other sources of climate finance that are like the one we just got a good presentation on, the Greek Climate Fund, where you think about instruments and the financial way of accessing. We also provide support as per the blending part. And we also, as EU, are committed and we remain committed to contribute our fair share as per the global commitment of reaching $100 billion for the period 2020 dedicated to climate change activities in developing countries. So, for the region, when it comes to climate action, we have different areas that we provide support under, and the GCCA Plus initiative is just one initiative. It's a global initiative, but it focuses on SEEDS and LDCs. But we have also other funding available, which goes into provision of climate services and support to disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management under the European Development Fund. And as I said, rest assured that seeds have been and remain a key priority for the European Union. So, well, this I will skip because tomorrow from 9 to 1 we will have a dedicated session to the Global Climate Change Alliance. We will explain everything about the initiative, and so in the interest of time I will just tell you about the intra-ACP, which concerns also this region, the Caribbean. What we do under this program is capacity building, support to national and regional climate change activities, strategy, implementation of strategies, and the national adaptation plans. And in the framework of the implementation of the Paris Agreement, we do support also your efforts in implementing commitments and under the nationally determined contributions under the UNFCCC framework, so of the Paris Agreement. We strengthen dialogue and both policy dialogue and technical dialogue. So these conferences are one way that we do that, and it is very important to continue. I mean, this is just one way, one channel to do it, but it is an important gathering to be all aware of what we do and share information. And it has been very interesting to get all the presentations by the scientists, researchers that are here, and the feedback from the government partners and regional institutions. So, well, in the region, here in the Caribbean, we have 7 programs under considering both EDF and DCA funding. As per climate services, which is also one of the key topics of discussion today, well, we know that it is a must in the sense of priority activity and service to be provided. We are working towards creating opportunities to make sure that opportunities and financial and technical, to make sure that we link the vast array of data and information, scientific information that is out there, and we got to know that there is a lot of information and studies and research carried out and analysis carried out. So it's really important that it gets to us and that we also see what are the opportunities and what you put forward as partners of what are the best ways to actually put this information into actionable programs and projects. So by the end of this year, the Commission will adopt for an amount of 85 million a program under the 11th EDF that will be dedicated to the provision of climate services. And well, I will give also their further details tomorrow. It is basically enabling for the ACP countries access to basically creating the network and providing the financial support to make sure that we are providing useful data to the implementers. We also support, of course, disaster risk reduction programs in the region, and well, specific programs that we have so far. We started, I mean, under the 10th EDF program, and we are continuing now on the basis of the EU strategy for resilience building for the period 2014-2020. We are dedicating an extra amount to DRR, and this amount is for the, I have to find my slide, just a moment. Oops. So far we have a number of programs, and well, the amount here is like, I have not found my slides, but it is, I apologize, haven't found it. It is above 300 million euros. I have not the exact figure because I lost I lost the slide. But there are different programs that we are supporting with with the 5 Cs, with World Bank. There are the climate risk platform for disaster risk reduction. We support also is EU the Insular Resilience initiative, which was established by the G7. So we have a number of ongoing initiatives in the field, and we very much welcome coordination with other projects and programs that are currently ongoing in the region. So we hope that by mentioning this, you will get to know who are the players and what are the programs, so to establish the right synergies to make them more effective. I will actually stop here in the interest of time and for the question and answers, and also because I really want to stress that tomorrow there will be a dedicated session to discuss in detail all the activities that we do in the region. So thank you very much, and I'm here for question and answers.
Thank you, Tani, for presenting the overview of the EU and GCCA supporting in the region. As she said, reiterating again, tomorrow we're going to start at 9 o'clock. We're going in detail the GCCA Plus program and how to access fund and what does it consist of and the different kind of projects and programs. So please be there on time with all your questions. Moving on, different kind of partners in the region. I would like to invite to the podium, and I will say this maybe in an Italian way, Gina Sanguinetti Phillips, or Sanguinetti, I don't know if it's Spanish, sorry for that, from the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. I got it right. So, please, come here.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm very pleased to be here on behalf of the CRIF CEO, Mr. Isaac Anthony, who unfortunately can't be here. He's actually in Washington with the World Bank trying to drum up some more money. So I was sent in his stead, but I'm very pleased to be here. For those of you who may not know, what exactly is CRIF? CRIF was formed in 2007 as the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, but we are actually now known as CRIF SPC, SPC meaning Segregated Portfolio Company. So we were reformed a few years ago as CRIF SPC, and that was primarily to enable us to expand, to offer new products and into new geographic regions, and I'll mention that in a little bit. So CRIF was the world's first multi-country, multi-peril risk pooling facility to offer parametric insurance products for catastrophe events, and we offer them to Caribbean and Central American countries. We operate as a not-for-profit organization, and we currently have 17 members, 16 in the Caribbean and 1 in Central America, that being Nicaragua. For those of you from Belize, I know that geographically you are in Central America, but you're also considered part of CARICOM, so we consider you one of our Caribbean members, so just to clarify that. So just a reminder, unlike regular indemnity insurance, parametric insurance makes payments based on the characteristics of natural hazards as well as modeled losses from those hazards on the affected country. And so that assessment can be done very quickly after an event, and so we don't have to wait for on-the-ground loss adjusters to do their assessment. So CRIF is committed to payments to countries whose policies are triggered within 14 days of the event. And we basically operate as a facility to provide short-term financial liquidity to cover immediate needs after an event. Oops. And during CRIF's 10 years in existence, we think we have demonstrated the proof of concept. As you will have seen after Hurricanes Irma and Maria, and I'll discuss that in a little bit, we've made payouts over $55 million this year alone, and we're probably not done yet because the hurricane season is still on us. And so we believe that governments in the region, governments in other regions, should seriously and consider investing in CRIF or other disaster risk transfer initiatives. And these are just an example of some of them. CRIF is an ex-ante risk transfer or risk financing mechanism, and we added that little light blue box in there because the original diagram started at 1 month, but because we can offer payments within the first month, we've extended it closer to the beginning, right after the event. And again, this is an investment by national governments that we are encouraging them to make. I'll just skip this. These are just some reasons why we think governments should invest. And as a reminder, so we offer 3 products currently. One for tropical cyclones, which are based on wind and storm surge. One for earthquake, and one for excess rainfall. The excess rainfall product is a much newer product. It was available only since 2013 because the modeling related to rainfall is just that much more difficult. And I think this point came up yesterday maybe about involving ministries of finance. One of the key things with CRIF is that our primary contacts in the countries are the ministries of finance. Because it's an insurance product that countries are purchasing, obviously that the final decision needs to be made by the Ministry of Finance, but we do encourage highly, I mean it's not a requirement because we can't require it, but we do encourage the ministries of finance to make these decisions in collaboration with the disaster management agencies and the meteorology agencies, earthquake agencies, and so on. And Mr. Kenneth Carr from Trinidad can attest we had a very productive meeting last year where all the agencies came together to discuss the policies for the upcoming year. So in this current year, we issued 41 different policies, tropical cyclone, excess rainfall, and earthquake. As you would imagine, not all countries have all 3 because of their different risk profiles. And speaking of which, CRIF creates country risk profiles for current and potential members because this is what the policy pricing for those countries are based on. So it's not a generic model for all of the Caribbean or all of Central America. It's based on the specific risk profile of the country. And we want to point out that many countries in the region do not have what we consider adequate coverage at the moment. We believe a figure of about 25% of government losses should be covered by CRIF insurance, and many countries are not at that level yet. Of course, to increase to that level would mean an increase in premium, and that's been the constraint so far. And just a caveat, in red, as you'll see, to note that CRIF was not designed to cover all the losses on the ground. It was, first of all, it only insures government losses, which is usually a subset of the total losses, and it's only to provide immediate liquidity to have the government be able to get up and running immediately after a disaster event. So as I mentioned, to date we've, well I didn't mention, but to date we've made $123.5 million in payouts to 12 of our 17 member governments. And recently, the last few years have been pretty active. In 2015, Dominica, of course, got a payout on their excess rainfall policy after Tropical Storm Erica. Last year in Matthew, Haiti received our single largest payout to date at almost $20 million, and they received about 23 in all for their tropical cyclone and excess rainfall policy. And of course, back in 2010, we would have paid out to Haiti after their earthquake in that year as well. And then so far this year, well, Irma is complete, but we paid about $31 million out for Irma, and so far for Maria, we've paid out 23.8. That's probably finished also. but there are other hurricanes yet to come. So again, all of these payments were made within 14 days, and for tropical cyclone, within 24 hours, the governments are contacted to tell them whether their policies are going to be triggered and what the payout amount is going to be. So it's almost money in the bank after 24 hours, so they know exactly. Payment however they see fit, but as you can imagine, donors are increasingly interested in how those monies are spent. Not just the donors, also the stakeholders and the citizens of the country. And so we do at least require or request of them to let us know how they're using the funds, and that might become a more formalized process in the near future. So in addition to our sovereign level products, we're also involved in microinsurance. We have a arrangement or collaboration with the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative and some reinsurance companies as well, including Munich Re. And we've developed two products. One is a livelihood protection policy, and one is the loan portfolio cover. The LPP targets individuals, so small farmers, tourism workers, day laborers, any private individual, and it protects their livelihoods against weather events but excess rainfall and wind. And again, it's a parametric product also, so within 2 weeks, persons who have purchased these policies will know whether they're getting a payout or not. We send out SMS text messages to their phones so they're notified, and so on. So there are 3 pilot countries that this was rolled out in: St. Lucia, Jamaica, and Grenada. And there have been 2 sets of payouts in St. Lucia to small farmers who's had damage due to what they call the December rains back in 2013, and also last year during Matthew. But just to note that this is not a product geared specifically for small farmers. It can also be purchased by fishers, and I'll talk about that initiative in a little bit, and any person whose income is likely to be affected by this severe weather. And we're expanding. It will start in November. Phase 2, expanding into Belize and Trinidad and Tobago. So we're trying to increase access and to tweak the models so that it will be more attractive and more affordable. And it's offered through the local insurance companies. Okay, so these are 3 new products that we're working on. The most far advanced is the drought product, and it's specifically addressing agricultural drought, looking at resulting losses due to reduced yield from drought, looking at 2 specific types of events: severe dry spell, short dry spell periods, and annual yield reduction. So this we're hoping to bring on board in time for the next policy year. Our colleague from the Caribbean Fisheries Mechanism spoke yesterday about the COAST project. We are one of the partners in that. The U.S. State Department is the main funder, and we are currently developing the models for the insurance products. And we're looking at both the sovereign level and the individual level. So again, as I mentioned, the livelihood protection policy earlier, it's looking at expanding that to be more applicable to fishers. And then we're also working on a larger agriculture product, which would take into account excess rainfall, of course, as well as drought. Our lessons learned: we need to keep premiums low. That's the key constraining factor for our members, and we're able to do this by pooling our risks, and that enables savings of up to 50% of what countries would be able to get if they went on their own. establishing these segregated portfolios to keep the risk separate, for example, Caribbean versus Central America. And we also need to be flexible and responsive to our members. The excess rainfall product was developed because of the gaps in the tropical cyclone product, which only affected wind and storm surge. And again, the drought product is an example of that. We need to increase understanding of CRIF products so that the decision makers really understand what they're buying, because even though we're 10 years old and countries have been purchasing policies since 2007, there's still a gap in a true understanding of how they work. We need to collaborate with partner organizations and continue to do that. And of course, engaging in donors. We need their continued support to develop the new products and expand into new regions. Whoops. And so the way forward is to try and basically expand on what we've been doing, and I'm going to go through here. We really want to get countries to increase their coverage. We noticed after the Haiti earthquake, a lot of other countries in the region increased their earthquake coverage all of a sudden. So we really want to work with countries to enable them to increase. Expanding within the Caribbean, there are other countries. We do have some overseas territories as members, like Anguilla and Turks and Caicos, for example. We're looking at other ones. Montserrat wrote to us saying they're interested in talking to us, and so on. So that is one financing mechanism that is available to overseas territories. And then just a brief mention before my time is up. We do have a technical assistance program. We're more than just an insurance company, so we do have partnerships with regional organizations. Many of you know that already because we're working with you. We also have a scholarship program and a small grants program. This is, as you can see, very small, $25,000. And the review period is not 18 months or 2 years. It's like 3 to 5 months. So we really encourage communities, especially in the affected islands, to take advantage of this opportunity and submit proposals for small grants in their communities. And it's an ongoing, year-round application process, and it's just look on the CRIF website and they'll be able to apply through that. We have a regional internship program. Again, many of you here know that because we placed interns in several regional organizations. And we do provide assistance to member governments outside of their insurance payments. For example, after Earl last year, government of Belize came to us and we've provided a grant to them to establish more weather stations to increase their early warning system capacity. And again, I mentioned the partnerships with regional organizations. And just one final word. Remember, risk insurance is not, somebody used the word today, holy bullet or magic bullet. It's not a magic bullet. It's only one financing mechanism, and it's only one part of your comprehensive disaster management system, which also has to include risk mitigation as well. So on that note, I'll stop.
And thank you so much, Gina. Very interesting to learn about potential opportunity at the small scale, but also the larger scale. So thanks. I'm sure there will be questions. Moving on, the last presenter for this session, then we'll move into a larger discussion for the next 45 minutes, an hour. I would like to invite Donna Gittens-Roach, which she will entertain us about the UN and Japan Caribbean Climate Change Partnership. That's it.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I know you've had a lot of information today, so I'm just going to very, very quickly go through some of the main elements for the Japan-Caribbean Climate Change Partnership and just outline very briefly the work that we've been doing and what our status is up to date. So during 2004, which was known as the year of the Japan-CARICOM Friendship, there were commemorative activities that took place both in Japan and in the CARICOM states. One of those activities during July of that year was the Japan-CARICOM Summit that was held here in Trinidad and Tobago. And on that occasion, the Prime Minister of Japan presented Japan's policies for CARICOM, which consisted of 3 main pillars. And one of those pillars was towards cooperation for sustainable development, as well as overcoming the vulnerabilities that are inherent to small island developing states. And on this occasion, an agreement was reached between UNDP and the government of Japan to establish the Japan-Caribbean Climate Change Partnership. So this is a project that started in May of 2015 and ends next year, December. Donor is the government of Japan with a total amount of about 15 million US dollars, and we target 8 countries which are listed on the slide for you to see. Oops. It's always sensitive. We have one main objective, and our objective is to advance the process of inclusive, low-emission, climate-resilient development. And that is to be accomplished through supporting key policy development, which would act as drivers towards countries meeting the obligations that they had outlined in their NDCs, and supporting the implementation of actual technology, which is low emission and advances climate risk management in each of the target countries. In the development of this project, we sought to go through the barriers and limitations which are inherent in this region and are not unfamiliar to any of you here. And in the development of the project, we also sought to come up with methods to get around the barriers so we can actually implement the things that we seek to implement. So to strengthen coordination, to build capacity to address the limited human resources, to have activities to address information gathering and compilation, to address baselines that were missing, and to support the integration of climate considerations into planning and budgeting mechanisms. So how do we address these main things on the screen? As it relates to climate policy, the activities are seeking to develop iterative, comprehensive NAMAs and NAPs for the selected Caribbean countries. As I said before, we're also looking to support the incubation of actual technologies in each of the countries and to demonstrate how those work. And as it relates to community development and community level participation, at each part of the project, the communities have been involved from the development of the pilot projects to determining what technologies suit them best, to articulating what their actual needs are and how we can best serve them to build resilience at the community level. So in order to put forward our approaches, we have 3 main outcomes, the first of which is to establish the NAPs and the NAMAs for the different countries, the second of which is to establish demonstration projects and allow for technology transfer and adoption in each of the countries, and the third is to strengthen knowledge networks and to facilitate South-South cooperation as well as North-South cooperation between Japan and the Caribbean region. Sorry, my hands are too heavy. So outcome 1, NAPs, National Adaptation Plans. So we are utilizing these as a way to develop medium and long-term adaptation strategies to address the needs that have been brought up by each of the countries. So we are undertaking work for this in 6 of the 8 countries: Belize, Guyana, Jamaica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia, and Suriname. And this process started with a series of stakeholder consultations in each of the countries, which involved community groups, public sector, and civil society. And in each of these, they articulated what their vulnerabilities were and how they thought we could best solve some of the issues and implement adaptation measures. So dependent on the country's needs and where they were in drafting their own adaptation plans, because all of the Caribbean countries have started at some level to implement adaptation policies, then we would have come together to agree on the best approach under this project. So for example, for Guyana and for Suriname, we are building on existing documents that they would have had and work that they would have undertaken because they've done quite a bit of work before. For Jamaica, they have a number of partners who are assisting them in the development of NAP, so we are providing them with coordination support for the CCD, which is the Climate Change Division. For St. Vincent and for St. Lucia, we're helping them with overarching NAPs and sector-specific policies, as well as investment plans. And for Belize, we are targeting specifically the agriculture sector and integrating that with the water. In all of this, we've also been working with the NAP Global Support Program, which is a joint initiative between UNDP and UNEP. And we're also working with the NAP Global Network, who's also supporting these countries in NAP development and in sector adaptation development. And we are coordinating work with them so we can dovetail it, maximize resources, and have maximum impact. Also under outcome 2, we have the nationally appropriate mitigation actions, and here we are working with all 8 countries. For this, we are supporting them to meet their obligations that they would have submitted in their NDCs. For each of the cases, we had for 6 of the countries, we had 2-day seminars, which was a joint initiative between UNFCCC and the United Nations Development Program Low Emission Capacity Development Program. So they provided some training on what the NAMA was, what the different components were, how you go about developing a NAMA, and how it fits into your national strategies. In addition to that, the ones that are highlighted, the 5 countries are highlighted. We are working with UNFCCC again to establish emission baselines, and the work for that will begin this year. For the transport sector, I know there was a discussion before on data and the availability of data and data gaps. As it relates to the transport sector, which is a notoriously difficult sector to develop a NAMA, there are a lot of gaps. In none of the countries that we're dealing with, St. Vincent and Belize, are there fuel consumption or emission data for that particular sector, and we are looking at utilizing models in order to determine what the standardized baselines are for those countries. Outcome 2 deals with demonstration projects and the implementation of actual technology, and we have 4 main focus areas under this outcome: water resource management, sustainable agriculture, community-based climate smart infrastructure, and renewable energy and energy efficiency. The picture for the water resource management is from a community in Clarendon in Jamaica, where we're helping to rebuild a cistern in that area for the persons who are not connected to the municipal water supply. For the sustainable agriculture, this is a small farmer in St. Vincent, and we're helping to rebuild his irrigation system, make it more efficient, and include things like the solar PV pumping systems. He will also be a lead farmer and open up his land to other farmers to learn the different techniques he's implementing, and this is being supported by IECA. The third picture is a picture for St. Vincent. Most of their country is hilly. Come from Barbados, so I'm not accustomed to that. Right here in the picture, you can see a road being undercut by water. This is a problem across St. Vincent, so we're doing quite a bit of infrastructure work for them. And then renewable energy, there are a few of these initiatives. The biggest one is in Guyana for the energy efficient street lights in Bartica as part of their Greening Bartica initiative. Right. So most of our projects are, surprising to us, in the sustainable agriculture focal area, followed by the water resource management, but we have realized that there's a great deal of overlap between the 2 focal areas. A lot of the sustainable agriculture projects have a very large water resource management component. And where we know, right now we have 22 projects approved and ready for implementation, and we have 14 more that are in various stages of development and evaluation. Outcome 3, this is our knowledge section. So this would have started off with a series of knowledge, attitudes, and perceptions and behavior studies across the region. And based on the outcomes of those studies, communication campaigns would have been developed, and methods to seek to promote behavior change, where we would have found that knowledge was high of particular climate challenges, but it didn't result in an immediate behavior change. Also under this component is north-south training, so there's an opportunity for farmers and other stakeholders within the region who are participating in the project to go to Japan and observe the technology that is being used there, and be able to decide what technologies are most applicable for their situation for better uptake of those. And there are opportunities for south-south cooperation. We've had a number of regional NAP workshops where different countries who've been through the NAP process have been able to articulate what their process has been, what their challenges have been, and been able to lend a helping hand to the countries who are now initiating those processes. And also another big component of this is youth empowerment. So we have sensitization and exposure for the youth. Right now we're having a youth climate change conference in Jamaica, which brings together 400 to 600 youth, most of which are from Jamaica, 40 of which are from across the region from our beneficiary countries, and 12 students from Japan. What have we learned so far? So we are at the midway point of our project, and we have learned a lot. First off, that integration of gender considerations into national strategies and into the pilot initiatives has been a challenge. In order for this to be successful, there needs to be a real understanding of how climate change affects, how gender is influenced by climate change, the disparities between the genders, and how this can be properly addressed under each of these strategies and the pilot projects. And I don't think that this is clearly understood. There's a substantial amount of knowledge at the community level. I believe one of our colleagues here talked about grassroots knowledge and not ignoring that. We've learned that the farmers and the people in the community who've asked for this have a substantial amount of knowledge which we've been able to build on and to help them to craft their pilot projects. The level of resources needed to implement climate actions is not often adequately considered. There are a lot of plans and plans to do policies on the books, but often the true cost and the true needs to have these things actionable on the ground aren't always considered at the planning stage or when we sign off on documents. There are a number of climate change coordination mechanisms, but a lot of them are not functioning optimally, and if we can get them functioning optimally, they would provide a great service in pushing the integration of climate considerations into policy. And oftentimes, these climate considerations are seen as an add-on and an additional burden. So the ministries of sustainable development and climate change and environment see this as their mandate, but when you go to ministries of transport, how works and stuff, they are not clear in how they're to integrate climate considerations into their work, and they see it as something that they don't need to do or something that's an additional burden. There's a need for robust baseline data. I think that that's been emphasized enough over the last couple days. Monitoring, evaluation, and reporting is paramount to ensure that we actually have the impact that we say we're going to have. So we are building those systems into our project to ensure that we can record what we are doing and report that back to the wider community so they can see where they've moved from. There's a need for comprehensive records, not only on our side, but for the different communities that we're going into to build capacity for record keeping, for build capacity for data collection so that they know where they started and where they're going to go and what the impacts are. And the regional collaboration has been very critical in this project. It's $15 million spread among 8 countries, not a lot of money when you spread it for so many activities. And our collaborations with UNFCCC, with LECB, with UNEP have been very critical in helping us to have a greater impact that we would have had otherwise. Oops. So just wrapping up, our actions will go towards building climate policy in the region, towards advancing climate action, to promoting innovation and adoption of technologies, to building capacity for key stakeholders for better understanding, planning, and response to climate change, and to building regional awareness. And lastly, this initiative is a reaffirmation of the commitment that the government of Japan has to the region to help them in the face of climate change. And we recognize that significant amounts of work have been done in the Caribbean, and we don't seek to replicate that, but to build on what has already been done. And just on the way forward, we will continue to complete the activities which I've outlined previously on the slide so we can inform future work in the region. And for more information, you can visit our website or follow us on Instagram. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna. So this brings to an end most of the presentation of the 3 days conference. So that's good. You don't have to stare at the screen anymore. But we'll have to stare at each other right now for the next probably half an hour, 45 minutes, and we would like to open the floor for a discussion which will touch on the session previous to lunch and this session. So for doing that, may I invite George to the discussion table, Mr. Rothenberg, Adele, which I saw she was going for coffee, but she will be back. Just a couple of quick, yeah, please come. A couple of quick words here. We're trying to put together policy, science, and finance, and we had some example without going through the list, like George is coming up, like about the trust fund. We heard from a different international partner. We also listened to different opportunities we might have. So I really would like and encourage you to really be interactive right now and ask any sorts of question. This is the time. The conference is moving towards a more discussion phase. So in the last couple, for the next couple of hours before we finish, we are an hour late, so we'll finish around 6, probably before. The idea is really to move our brains and minds and experience, starting maybe from the specific to the general. One last thing, then I shut up. If you need coffee, you go and get coffee, you come back. Otherwise, I start chasing you down. I can start using a bit of my European attitude. So please, I open the floor again on this topic. Please, okay, we start with Dr. Leslie, then we have 2, 3, please.
Thank you. I have a question for our colleague from CRIF. I missed a part of it. Initially, CRIF was dealing with the governments using the parametric technique, and I heard you mention individual farmers can now get the coverage. Could you explain a little bit more how they would go about doing it? Do they go through the government, or they can go one-on-one through the insurance, as you said?
Let me just stress, first of all, the individual products, it's not specifically a CRIF product. It is through this initiative by the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative. Be that as it may, the persons who wish to purchase those policies purchase them directly from their local insurance companies. So as I mentioned, it's a pilot project so far. So St. Lucia, Grenada, and Jamaica are the only ones that are in it now. And there is a specific insurance company in each of those countries that sells these particular policies. And we're expanding, starting in November, to Trinidad and Belize. But government is not involved, apart from laying the groundwork to enable this to happen.
Yes. Just a comment and some quick questions. Listening, nobody doubts about the science and the effort, but what is bothering me from the NGO standpoint is that a lot of the mechanism are through governments. And by that in itself create a set of biases, because non-governmental organizations, the sector which I come from, are seen as nuisance by government because we are the referee between the extremism and so forth. What I'm saying is that most of the mechanism that is set up goes through government. I've heard a lot about what NGO or civil society, real civil society can access directly. Of course, when you have consultations, you bring in a few NGOs or farmers or what have you, and we say we have consulted the people. Most of the time, it's just superficial. But the depth of the thing is that if you have these funds coming up, you have funds going into countries, you have NGOs, you have private sector. Let's say the Japanese funds, when that is gone now, what's the sustainable end of this? For example, my concern is that the whole concept of we building our climate resilience or dealing with climate change is dependent on donor funding. But I don't mind seeing donor funding come in the front. But at the same time, it must lead towards where we are sustainable, or the process is sustainable, or we could build mechanism within the region to reduce our dependency on donor funds. Because if this is so important, it must be integrated into our system of financing, of management, etc. And that's why I feel that the civil society and NGO and private sector has a very key role to play. And most of what I've heard here is everything going through a government or a national authority, authorizing agents, etc. And it is making me feel that we are not looking at the sustainable end, the financing ourselves end of this whole measure.
That's a very important point. I don't know if anyone wants to react from the panel. Yes. Can you pass the microphone to George, please?
Yes, thank you for raising this. This is a particular issue which was addressed and considered in some detail in designing the BVI Climate Change Trust Fund. It was recognized that the trust fund, although government set it up by passing the law to actually establish it, the trust fund is an arm's length fund. And not only is civil society represented in a majority on the trust fund trustees, but more importantly, there's a special mechanism in the legislation which provides that certain amount of the fund will be dedicated to community-based initiatives and NGO activities. So NGOs and society are allowed to access the fund. It's also recognized that community-based and NGO organizations have limited capacity to write projects, deliver projects, manage projects, set up bank accounts. So a part of the legislation actually says that the fund shall support the capacity building so they can access the fund. So it's a problem if you don't have the resources and ability to and capacity to access this. So in setting up the BVI Trust Fund, this is enshrined in the legislation that a key element of this is to provide access to society, access to NGOs. There's a cap on how much government can actually access through the trust fund. The trust fund is entirely an arm's length trust fund. And this is really a model which I think a lot of the countries in the region should be considering, and certainly some of the delivery mechanisms for regional trust funds going forward. We need to look at those issues of civil society participation in a meaningful manner, not just tokenism. Yes, we've consulted with them and government carries on administering it. And it also ensures the sustainability. It's responsive to needs of communities and also builds capacity and the long-term support for the fund itself.
Thank you. Anybody else from the panel who would like to react on this topic on sustainability of the fund before we go to the next question? Anybody else? Okay, we have a... Is on this topic or is on another? Okay, so Christophe, please.
Good afternoon. Maybe a question for Dieter. The GIZ is holding the Secretariat of Insur Resilience Initiative, and I wanted to know if you would be in a position to tell us what is being done in the region, for example. I know they're also associated somehow with the CRIF, but there's more into micro-insurance. So I don't know if you know about it, but I don't recall to see it in your presentation. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the question. As I think said at the beginning, GIZ is like an implementing entity working on behalf mainly, not only, but mainly of the government of Germany. So it is for us, while of course it's possible that we are participating in regional initiatives which are linked to our projects, to play a role in a new initiative, also for example with their funding and expertise and come in there, we need to have the mandate from the German government to do that. Now really I'm not in a position to know what is the background about that particular initiative and the German government involvement or non-involvement in that, but that's how GIZ is working. So we cannot decide, if you want, on our own who we want to work with and where we want to work, because basically the funding is funding between the government of Germany and the respective country or the respective region of CARICOM, for example. And so this is the agreement on government level, and we are implementing it.
Just to add to that, as you said, there is a link with CRIF, and for example, this year the German government did provide resources to CRIF specifically for the expansion into Central America and the development of the excess rainfall product, because I think it was 2 years ago, the G7 did announce that they want to increase access to climate insurance, and they wanted to do it through facilities like CRIF, like the ARC and the Pacific. So the German government is an active donor to CRIF to enable us to expand coverage.
Thank you. Yes, we go to the gentleman over there.
Yes, thank you. I want to thank the well, both panels for the contributions that they made, because what they presented to me resonated in a big way to a number of things, or a number of thought processes I had, including the question I asked on day one, and including the point raised by St. Lucia earlier today. So for climate analytics, and for George in his first presentation, it resonated because it spoke to policy. And I wanted to find out here today how many of us are aware of what is required going into the AR6, and whether or not we are dealing with issues that are relevant. And I'm putting that on the table in the sense from the question that was asked with respect to the 5 Cs becoming more of a trigger to the region to enable government representatives to be present at the table at the IPCC, so that we can have a larger consensus in getting whatever we discuss and try to produce in the region that are relevant to us to be taken up. Because a lot of what we are saying here is good, but I do not know how much of us knows that it is the synthesis report that is important at the IPCC for policymakers that feeds into the UNFCCC. And it is at that level that we need to get our information in. And if we are going to do that, then we need to have Caribbean representatives at the IPCC to make advocacy. Because more often than not, sometimes it's 2 or 3 or 4 people. And it is overwhelming at times. So we are asking if the IPCC, similar to what it does for the COP, if they can engage the governments through the CARICOM to see if the governments could get their representatives at the IPCC. But that goes to a bigger picture. What are the policies that we want and what is relevant? We heard a presentation that was made, I think yesterday, on loss and damage. I do not know how much of us in here knows that for the IPCC and the UNFCCC, that's a taboo word. You can't get those words into the document. And therefore, I want to employ the IPCC, the 5 Cs, to try to see if you could become the bridge where you could assist our regional entities to develop in a way that we can get our information in. For example, it may not be loss and damage, but it could be residual impacts, it could be residual risk, so that our research must speak to those things, irreversible loss or non-economic loss, because they are under the same umbrella. But when you start to talk loss and damage, our research, if you put anything in there with loss and damage, it's going to be ignored. And this is, in my view, where the 5C comes in. We need to be very proactive and be engaging with governments and with the policymakers to try to find out where we can bridge the gap, because I thought that we lost an opportunity here today to engage the negotiators, because the invitation said 3 key persons: your focal point for UNFCCC, your IPCC rep, and your negotiator at UNFCCC. But yet we are not given that opportunity to say to the Caribbean community what are the key issues and what are the relevant issues. Thank you.
Okay, that's well taken. So I don't think we didn't lose any opportunity. We're still here, we still have some time, so you can go into the details. So I open the floor to everybody, to the community here, to maybe narrow down these priorities, have a discussion. These are the time to do it, and we still have time before we break. So if anyone wants to take some of the reaction from this, otherwise we lose an opportunity. But I'm trying to stimulate that. We are here to talk. So what are the major priorities I would like to be pushed in the IPCC, in the UNFCCC, in the COP23, in terms of finance, in terms of technical? Yeah, I shut up in a second, but just trying to stimulate, the floor. I know we're tired, but we still have today, a bit of tomorrow, so we still have also dinner where we can talk about this. So I'm trying to get a feel of we can react to a very important point that was just made. So again, I'm here to moderate. So we have George and we have Madame here, and we go over there. Yes.
Yes, I'd like to follow up and respond, and perhaps more prompt some discussion in that regard. We've had
series of discussions the last 3 days. We're looking at climate science, climate services. We're talking about policy. We're talking about financing. And these are very complex issues for the region to deal with, but even more complex for the governments to deal with. And we've done a lot of work in this region on vulnerability assessments. We've had some tremendous presentations, work done, the research, the data information. That seems to be coming together very well. And I think the time has come for us to take the next big step and look at managing climate change risk at the national level. And that means putting together a roadmap on how do we do this. Yes, we have NAMAs, NAPs, we have adaptation policies, we have risk management tools, and we have pieces on the climate services and the climate science, and we have risk management assessments, and we have some pieces on the financing. But there isn't really a blueprint, a roadmap for the national governments to say, here are the pieces I need to put in place, and here's where I can get support, and here's the end of the tunnel that I need to go to. And until we have some understanding that we can go to the governments and say, it's not perfect, and it's an evolving one, but this is at least us taking the agenda and working with it, rather than responding to an international agenda from the IPCC or from the donors or from whatever research program is being funded. And I think the 5 Cs have done a tremendous job getting us to this point. But I think the next big step is saying we need to pull these very disparate pieces together and provide guidance to the governments on how to develop a national framework where this all comes together. Because I think we've done some work. We've done pilots all over the place, but nobody still has got a blueprint on how to do this kind of work at the national level, and then feed that back to the IPCC discussions and say, we can actually inform other governments on how to do this, because everyone around the world is battling on what does a national framework for climate change risk management actually look like when you bring in climate science, climate services, climate financing, and make sure this is country-driven. There is no framework. There's no guidance on how to do this. And certainly this has come out very clearly from what I've heard over the last 3 days. We've got the pieces there, but the governments are still saying, well, how do we manage this? How do we go forward on that?
Thank you. That's a clear suggestion, also probably implementable. I don't know how long will it take, but I think we should take this in our notes and see how can we move forward, because that's a very practical application. Again, hopefully we can get some more comments if it's feasible and how can be done. We have Madame Rosemary here. Do you have a microphone? You don't? Yes? Then we go over there and then we over there.
So I'm from UNDP. I'm the program officer in charge of energy, environment, and disaster management for Trinidad and Tobago. I have a question for Ms. Phillips from CREF. The estimation of premiums is based on a model. Does the model take into consideration the level of preparedness of the countries in terms of policies and strategies that they may have in place? Because that's one way to link risk, policy, risk, and results in a very concrete way, to encourage countries to actually put these things in place so they lower their premiums. And therefore, I think that's something I'm really interested to find out if you have an answer for that.
Sure. There are 2 points I'd like to make. One is the model. One of the modules in the model is related to vulnerability. So in addition to looking at the actual assets on the ground, the vulnerability of those assets is also factored into the model. But of course, once the model is set, it probably will remain unchanged for maybe up to 5 years. So, no annual changes would be included. But we're also in discussion with SEDIMA about an initiative where SEDIMA would create some kind of disaster readiness index for each country. And I mean, this is still very, very preliminary, with the idea that perhaps there could be a premium discount depending on that index the readiness of a particular country according to that index. So we are aware of those particular issues.
Thank you.
Thank you. We go over there without forgetting this priorities issue for 5C. I'll keep going back because I just want to push you because otherwise, okay, we have coffee, we have good lunch. And
so I'm going back to the point about the whole IPCC, the whole negotiation process. For me, I think we're at the point now where we have finally understood how to get our authors on. For once, we have so many authors in IPCC. So we need the authors at the table. We need the negotiators from UNFCCC at the table. We need the IPCC representatives at the table to sit together and to discuss what issues are so they can go and represent their countries properly, bearing in mind all of the other countries and the issues they will bring and how they will hit us down at every turn. It might also speak to capacity building in terms of negotiating skills for the persons that are going. But very, very importantly, it pains us to go to these meetings and see the flags of the Caribbean islands empty. And when you look around the room, they have 3, 4 people. And these 3, 4 people run from meeting to focus to contact group to, yeah. You are invited, you are sponsored, and you don't attend. So we need we need to look at the whole picture. We need to see the importance of IPCC because the same countries attend UNFCCC. So we're not sure why, but they don't attend IPCC. So we need to look at the whole picture.
Thank you for the call of awareness, I would say, to be diplomatic. But yes, we do. You have a chance, so let's maybe probably be proactive. But again, trying to be diplomatic correctly and moderating. Please.
So I'm going to just use Jackie's comments as a point of departure and not to repeat what she said, which is what I was going to say. But so to move forward to if we can come up with a game plan, which probably may be seated in my friends at the 5Cs. Because if we are going to be talking about capacity, yes, we have to go to the meetings. Yes, we have to be at the table. And as our friends say, if you're not at the table, then you're the meal in the plate. So we need the authors to be at the table, and that's a national issue. The countries have to move forward to nominate the authors to participate. The chapters for AR6 is already decided, so this is looking forward. We have to nominate the authors. Proudly, Jamaica now has, I think, 4 or 5 lead authors for this report, and if the opportunity arises, it will. But the countries have to nominate the author. Once they are nominated, then they will get exposed to the process. And then once they are exposed to the process, then the coordination can begin. And that is where I think the 5Cs then could play a role, because once we have a critical mass of authors around the region, then a coordination role as to how we treat with that. But we have to start at the country level to engage in the process. Last year, for the first time, the IPCC had an outreach event in the Caribbean region. And there are signals that they would want, even though we said it would never happen again, there are signals that they will come back in 2018 for another event. It is an opportunity for us. Thanks.
Thank you. That's great. I'm noting down, so far I have 3 priorities. One is this this national climate and risk framework to be developed at national level suggested from George, if I get it correctly, but then in the notes we can. The second one is the more active participation in meeting and table, so be present when you get invited and be active on that, even though capacity, human resources might be limited. And then the third one, which I'm just getting here, is the nomination of leading authors for each country, which should be done fairly quickly, so they can be exposed to the process and bring forward the priorities. Yes, we go, unless there is some comments from the panel, I go, yes, okay, you go.
This is on? Yeah, I'd just like to comment on being an author in the IPCC, because I was involved with the last assessment report. Those of us that are coming from the SIDS as researchers, we often wear many hats. And so being an author on the IPCC is one of many things that you are expected to do, whereas our authors that come from the Annex 1 countries have a full cadre of graduate students that are helping them, and so they get their issues in there. And so I think we need to do something on the regional level to support our authors that do end up making it on the IPCC writing teams, because it is incredibly difficult to have that research support backative to push when you are in those chapter writing teams. So that's something that we also need to look at.
Thank you. Well noted. The supporting facility, I would say, but you can frame it a different way, please.
Thank you.
Yeah, you have to, like you're singing, really. Should be on.
Hello. Yes. So, hi everybody. My name is Sasha Jatin Singh, and I'm representing ClimateTracker.org, and we are a global online platform of young people that report on climate issues and climate conferences and meetings nationally, regionally, and internationally. And I have to say, over the last 3 days, my colleague and I have to say that Damian Clark is probably the youngest person in the room here. He's a third-year student at UWI St. Augustine, studying environmental management and sustainable technology. So this conference has been quite eye-opening for him, just to see the amount of climate information, research, and success stories and results coming from the various climate action projects and programs occurring throughout the region. And what we've been hearing over and over is the importance of developing suitable and appropriate communication and knowledge sharing strategies in the region in order to disseminate this sort of information and in order to craft suitable messages nationally and internationally. And what we have, the issues we have here are, as you know, and we've discussed this over and over, limited resources, financial and human resources. And what I want to do is to invite countries and institutions to partner with ClimateTracker.org, because you have a cadre of young professionals, young students in various fields from science, economics, medicine, health, so forth, that actually will be able to craft these messages and work with you in order to showcase the climate data and research and results to the world. And it will also enable young people to really be part of the decision-making processes, because we will be engaging with the policymakers, with the researchers, and with negotiators as well. So we could be a means to maximize the resources available here in the Caribbean, to showcase the work and showcase the issues that our Caribbean negotiators want to showcase to the world at the COPs, at the IPCC meetings, and so forth. And the Caribbean hub of the climate trackers, we only started about 2 years ago, and so far we have over 400 young people across the Caribbean. So you have resources available to you. And I invite you to definitely go to our website, climatetracker.org, and also come and talk to us to see how we could collaborate with you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very timely indeed, this intervention. And lovely to see young people getting more involved. Also, specialized young people actually ties back to the point Adele just made about having a support system of different students and researchers, young researchers. So if I repeat correct, climatetrack.org? Track tracker, okay. .org. Yeah, well, we will circulate that, but thanks for the intervention. Yes, any comments on this from the panel? Otherwise, I take some other question in terms of the anything. Oh, sorry. Yes, sorry. No? Okay.
Thank you, Adrian Trotman from CIMH. I just want to reiterate
A bit closer, sorry.
I just want to reiterate one of the things that I mentioned on Monday during my presentation. And I think it's part of the reason, not the entire reason, of course, why we don't have that critical mass of authorship. We talk about capacity and all that stuff. That also fits in here. But I would want to say again that unless we invest more in research, we will never have that critical mass for authorship. The reason why Jamaica can have 5 is that the mechanism that I'm not sure next to you that she earlier that she spoke about earlier, that kind of a mechanism, supporting mechanism. You have the University of West Indies at Mona. They're starting to build that network of researchers that is necessary. That should be an eye-opener in itself as to what's necessary to have that critical mass. We have to invest more in research. If we talk about baselines, a lot of baselines come out because of research. And if baselines are where we have to start, I think my friend from the UNDP Japan project indicated that having a baseline is an issue. Where is the investment in research? Not just climate research, but everything you have to relate climate to be able to adapt. Where is our research investment?
Yeah, where is it? Let's see. If we see if we can. This is an important, serious issue that, rightly so, you create also, as you said, the critical mass of researching and researchers. So maybe we can a bit, discuss how we can bring together this investment in research. I mean, we have a different potential financial mechanism. The GCF might not be the way because they require research before you submit a proposal. But again, this is the time to think a bit creatively. How can we, we are in the same room, how can we have together, yes, we have the gentleman on the far end and over here. Yeah, over there.
Good evening, Glendale D'Souza from the Caribbean Meteorological Organization. I have listened to the topics over the last 3 days and found them quite interesting. Adrian is talking about research, but Kenneth Kerr made a point on Monday afternoon. Who is benefiting from the research? You do the research and where is it going? When Dr. Ruttenberg spoke this morning from GIZ, he spoke about there being a missing link between the researchers and the technocrats in the ministry. So research is being done, but it's going nowhere because the technocrats have no buy-in to the research. So therefore, I have a suggestion. And it could probably be run by the 5 Cs, but let's bring together the researchers and the stakeholders who we think will benefit from the research. That was the technocrats in the ministries, the different sectors, and we do it in a sort of quadrennial basis where the researchers can inform their stakeholders what is being done, and the stakeholders can inform the researchers what they would like to see coming out of the research. And that can be used to drive the region's research capacity so that there will be a ready and available user community, because you can't create policy in a vacuum. If you define a policy for me and I had no buy-in to making that policy actually work, I will do nothing to make that policy work. But if I influence where the policy creation process is going to be, then I can see if I meet every 4 years, well, they took my ideas in the last time, so I will continue with this process. And therefore, it will be a win-win situation for the Caribbean. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's well noted. Not sure how we can materialize this kind of either events or this kind of continuous, gathering of researcher and, as you said, policymaker and technocrats, but definitely will go in our report. Again, is I'm here to stimulate, so if anyone wants to volunteer, thinking about it, not right now, but like how to bring together these sorts of events would be very useful, as we can see, because we're really linking policy and science, as our audience maybe is a bit skewed today towards more science than policy. Having said that, any reaction from the panel on those points? Yes, George.
I think there's a clear need to provide some guidance on what is the nature of research, what is the nature of the baselines that are needed, particularly when you look at the Paris Agreement commitments. The countries have to report on indicators for adaptation and mitigation. Do they have baselines for that? Do we have indicators in how we report on it? What are we reporting on? So the research agenda is moving very rapidly. We have commitments under NDCs. We have to report on them. There is funding available under the CIBIT program and various others. The GF is funding. But we don't have the basic research. We don't have the baselines, for a start, against which we're reporting our adaptation measures. We don't have indicators. We certainly don't have the capacity. We don't have the guidance. So a lot of work, and this is constantly evolving. This is very rapidly evolving. So how do we report on Paris Agreement commitments? How do we report on NDC commitments if this whole research agenda haven't even been flagged during our 3 days here? This is a new one. Yes, it's a baseline issue. Yes, it's a research issue. It's a science issue. It's a climate services issue. But this is just one area where a tremendous amount of work needs to be undertaken. And that's just one area. And I think the 5Cs is well positioned to really map this out. We do need clarity on what is the research agenda here going forward. Paris Agreement, NDC compliance, adaptation indicators, baselines, that's just one. And that's from the policy perspective. I'm a policy person. I'm concerned about this from a policy perspective. And we have sector specialists who have very different agendas. And I think clearly what we hear for the last 3 days is we need some clarity. We need to map this out. We need to say we have roles and responsibilities and we have wonderful resources, but we can't work in vacuums. We need to say this is what needs to be done. Otherwise, we cannot comply with the Paris Agreement. We cannot report. We cannot verify. We can't even move forward because we only have baselines, let alone the support and indicators and work going to support that.
Thank you so much. I noted the point about what's the research agenda and what's the research focus and all these other missing pieces, unfortunately, in terms of baseline and indicators. Again, thinking creatively, what would be the next steps here in terms of addressing this issue? More meetings, workshop. I mean, this is where we have to add an intervention right there. I'm correct? Yeah.
Yes. Good evening. I'm Jeffrey Simmons, Bahamas Department of Meteorology. I just want to put in something with the authors. And, you know, Adele mentioned that the authors need support. And I don't know, you know, we seem to be getting more authors involved in the IPCC process. And now, you know, it's about time that we kind of step up our game as we go into it. In that maybe we need to look at once the authors have been chosen, at some meeting for the authors so that they can and not only for the region but also for SIDS, where they can strategize and also find out where support lie for them as they go into the process. Because one thing getting authors in, but we want to make sure that the authors we get in are prepared, because being involved in the IPCC process, you know, a lot of times when you know, those of us from SIDS are trying to push an issue on the floor, also especially when we are actually reviewing the documents. You know, authors do have a say in it, and if we don't have any authors on those teams, and I mean strong authors who are in position to really push some agenda for us, it's almost useless, because you remember we already outnumbered there on the floor to begin with. And so to be outnumbered in the plenary, and also in the authors like that, you know, where we don't have that strong support, it could become an issue for us in getting what we would like to see in the IPCC document in.
Okay, thank you so much. That's yet another important point, and we're taking note of that. Moving in this direction, I would like to, we haven't probably since the discussion seems to heading towards some, productive, we have another 5 minutes before we move to the last session, before the conclusion remarks. There is any other comments, any other question in terms of priorities, agenda? This is the time, okay? Please be brave, be courageous, make a fool of yourself. That's the idea. Yeah, 1 and 2. Okay, we go over there. Sorry, here on the right, and then my right, and then please.
Okay, thank you. Susan Singh Renton, CRFM. I want to support the point about developing the research agenda and the agreement that 5Cs is best placed to do that. I think it was Adele who mentioned about the forum, the networking that 5Cs facilitates. And even though you may want to have a climate modeling discussion and you want to have a social science discussion, I think it's important to actually host a forum where all the pieces are coming together. And that forum can inform the development of the research agenda and make better use of the resources that are available for research. And if there is more financing required for research, maybe that forum can offer some ideas, because you will be bringing the parties together. That forum, by the way, should include the stakeholders as well. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very practical suggestion. We can take in every volunteer into hosting that forum, that kind of forum, please. We have 2 more interventions and we have to move on. Yes, 1 and 2. No, you're second, sorry. Yep.
Mine's a question, Adrian, if you wanted to follow on to that. Okay. A question for Mr. de Romilly about the BVI Climate Change Fund. I know you spoke earlier a little bit about the rationale for it in terms of providing financial support to NGOs, but I'm wondering what the primary driver was for setting it up as an independent fund, as opposed to, say, alternative methods of funds going into departments of economic development or into a specific NGO fund.
There was a number of drivers for that. The need for the donors who are preparing to put money into international climate change financing to have a country-driven mechanism that they can provide funding, but there's some transparency, some accountability, and it's tied to a national program for climate change. Obviously, budget support is an important mechanism for countries, but unfortunately, what they've seen from budget support is that the funding goes into general revenue, and we're not sure how the money's spent. So having an arm's-length trust fund gets away from that. So the countries have to report on how much money they've committed to climate change. They can say, I've put money into the trust fund, and the trust fund is operated in a manner that I know exactly where the money's gone. It's on this project, this initiative. I can say how much is on gender, how much is on civil society, how much is on government initiatives. That is only possible through this kind of mechanism, where the BVI has set up that mechanism so there's transparent, it's accountable, the donors can show where the money's gone, private sector investors can show where their money's gone, they can have a dedicated fund for just a certain initiative. So it supports philanthropic investments and various others. So that was one driver. The second driver was really to make sure that the country responds to its own national culture and circumstances. They do recognize that the civil society and the private sector have to be a major driver on this, and particularly the tourism sector there. Tourism sector have to convert to being a low-carbon, climate-resilient tourism sector. We've seen one of the photographs, and the yacht chart industry is being devastated. This is one of their key drivers for their economy. If you don't have an arm's-length trust fund, which is representatives of the industry are on those trustees, you don't have the degree of comfort that, yes, it's a government fund and I can put applications in, but really I'm not having, this is not responding to my needs, not responding to what I want. So having that trust fund it really meets local circumstances, because there is the comfort that the industry, when they supported this, and they were very supportive, in fact, getting the levy in place, they had some comfort that we'll support this because we are on the board of trustees, and we know we have access to the fund for doing the conversions to the hotels, doing the risk assessments for the hotels, building capacity, making the products available to the tourism industry, to communities and various others. So that was really one of the other drivers which really made sure it was an arm's-length trust fund set up, not a government-driven one, and it wasn't just a mechanism going through budget support, which is another option which was put on the table.
Thank you. We take the last one from this session. Yep.
Okay. Thank you very much. I want to express a degree of frustration. The intervention about the research and policy-making community, and that perhaps we need fora for that dialogue to take place. Well, I just want to relate a personal experience. For the last 10 years, I've been attending something called the High-Level Forum of Ministers with Responsibility for Water. It takes place every year. It'll take place next week in Guyana. You get ministers from all over the Caribbean coming and talking with industry, water industry professionals. It's been going on for 10 years, right? So it is not that researchers and practitioners and policymakers that we don't know what the research needs are and the research agendas that need to be engaged on, that we don't know what they are. The real crux of it comes down to where is the money and where are the people that are going to do this? Because the ministers will come and say, we need this, we need this, we need this. But their budgets are stretched and they don't see the need, the absolute priority to put money into that from their side. And they turn around to the industry and research academia and say, well, you need to help us do that. So we go away and we look for money for it. It is extremely difficult for universities in this region. We are not as well endowed as universities and other institutions from other parts of the world. It is very difficult for us to get funds for research. If we don't get significant funds for research, we cannot employ young Caribbean persons coming out of our universities. We cannot afford to fund them to undertake that research. And you know what's happening? They are going to other parts of the world. And then sometimes they get recycled back to us. And we're paying twice the amount for that. It is very difficult for us to get that money to be able to build groups and to provide employment opportunities and research opportunities. And the mechanisms that are there in other parts of the world are just absent from this region. We've been able to do it to a certain extent through the climate modeling group, and it has required the intervention of quite a number of funding agencies over a number of years. So I'm really here saying, I don't know where to go. I'm frustrated by this. I personally have got 3-4 people working with me at the moment who in a few months' time, my funding has run out for them. People who've been working for 3 years, 4 years, building up expertise. Where is their future? So I'm expressing some frustration here. There's some great ideas, baseline research needed. Yes, yes, yes. We know that. But give us the tools and the money to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we take the frustration. Yes, I see. I'm going to come to you then. I appreciate this kind of intervention. Just want to, again, I'm here trying to facilitate and moderate, but I'll pass the ball back to you, saying, my experience through the U.S. system, where this part of my education is that sometimes they have this fundraising. I don't know if they will work here. But that's how most universities will get their money. I know it's a different economy. I know it's different, but also we have to think, and you maybe contradict me here. What will be, some applied intervention, applied events, applied strategies that will bring that fund money to research. We might want to sit down and think, but it's not just going to come. I know you're going to ask for it, but who are we going to ask to it? Should we, again, call for a funding, raising campaign? No, these are just ideas I'm throwing out there just to be practical, but that's, I see where, all the community together might have more strength than singular researcher going after some funding. Saying that, please, Tani.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a reaction to the frustration of Dr. Cashman. I totally agree that the issue remains like funding and prioritizing funding for research. But I'd like to give, let's say, a positive thought on that. There are a number of programs, and definitely the GCCA is one, and it actually promotes collaboration with research institutions, scientific institutions, academia, and the challenge is indeed to get also you partners sitting together at the table and also proposing how to integrate these kind of objectives and priorities into a wider program. Basically, we have examples also, for example, in, okay, it's an African example, but where we support integrated coastal zone management, and together with support for physical activities there, we support the development of curricula at the university to actually promote more awareness, public awareness, and on the topic, and create also the skills and the capacity there in local, in the country, to follow up on that. So I think, I mean, there is room, is also the way then you partner together with your national institutions in sitting down, and the 5 Cs, for example, could indeed channel, is a big player in the region, and there are a number of things that we could do. This is, of course, one of them, but I would really suggest, strongly suggest, to, when it comes to proposing through our, I mean, it's just one part of the funding, the EU, so it is some kind of leverage that I think it's worth to explore for integrating objectives that relate to promotion of research and really making sure that we promote the creation also of science-based information that then can be used concretely and integrated into the national plans. So it's also a task that I leave here for you to reflect on how to approach government institutions and propose projects, basically, that have these kind of components. We would really welcome that.
Thank you, Tanit, and we should take that as an opening and opportunities. Please be here tomorrow when we start discussing GCCA Plus and potential funding opportunities. That will be probably a way to release some of your frustration. So we take one more question, and then we have to move on due to time, unless you want to keep discussing.
Not a question, but a comment to Dr. Cashman's frustration. I suppose one step we can make or consider, at least in that direction, is taking the case of the on-the-job training program right here in Trinidad. One of the things that work well, at least during my time. I'm a product of that program, graduating out of the University of the West Indies. I was employed under that program, and I think it's one thing that we can take a model after. And maybe if we can develop, as regional institutions, a tailored program that we can pitch to the regional governments is something that we can, it's an idea I want to pitch. We can think about it, consider it, something that we can craft together as regional institutions and pitch to the regional governments, at least to address our deficit in research skills.
Thank you so much, and the idea has been noted. So this leads to the end of this session and discussion. I would like to thank, first of all, the presenter from the session prior lunch and after lunch. So thanks very much for your presence. Thanks to you for being engaged and being active in the discussion. We took some notes, and we'll definitely put this in the report. Now, we have 2 items before the end of the day and the end of the conference, so we're about an hour late. It's not too bad. Having said that, refill yourself again on coffee here and there so you come back. I would like to give the chair to Mark to come up here and run his session. For question of times, 45, 50 max, because then we'll have some closing remarks, but I trust your judgment and word.
It's never a good idea asking people to take coffee at 5 and come back, you know. Anyway, good afternoon again, and we will move into our final session. This session deals with science, policy, and finance interface in the Caribbean context. We have as presenters this afternoon Deputy Ambassador for Belize to the UN, Ms. Koi Felson, followed by Mr. Kishan Kumar Singh, Head Multilateral Environmental Agreements, Ministry of Planning and Development, Trinidad and Tobago. And thirdly, Dr. Roger Pulwarti, Senior Science Advisor for Climate and Director of the National Integrated Drought Information System at the NOAA. I'll ask these individuals to kindly come on stage. Yes, this last session is expected to be a panel discussion, so it will be fairly free-flowing, relaxed, fairly informal, but seeking to probe and having heard the discussion for the last 3 days, to really seek to map a way forward. Because it's one thing for us to have sat here for the last couple of days, discussed a number of issues. Out of the last session began to emerge some specific solutions or recommendations, I should say, which can be taken forward. But we're hopeful within this particular panel discussion. We can look at what are some of the gaps currently impacting our greater engagement and involvement with regards to building climate resilience and seeking to realize our ambitions under our nationally determined contribution. Hopefully, we will also be able to flesh out what are some of the larger global issues that we need to be confronting. And last but not least, the biggest elephant in the room, finance and resources. And this is important for us because what has been coming throughout the last 3 days is the issue that we do recognize that even though there is the need to have clearly articulated action plans and implementation plans, these need to be fairly flexible to accommodate ongoing changes. Because what we have recognized is even though we want to be determining our own destiny, because of graduation issues, many of our countries have difficulty finding that fiscal space within which to operate. Outside of that, we still are suffering with various financial and natural disaster issues. So we ask the question, what does natural disaster have to do with an economy? Grenada is a case in point. If you're going to lose 200% of your GDP in one event, then that throws your entire balance of payment out of whack. Being able to recover from an event like that would take years. Therefore, we cannot deny that there will still be requirements for the kinds of financial, human resource, and other kinds of assistance as we go forward. So we're hopeful that our three well-known presenters this afternoon, who have each carved out a name for themselves in the international and regional arenas, would help us in better articulating not just what are the challenges, but also what are some of the solutions. So I will first call upon Ambassador Koi Felsen to provide us some brief remarks.
Thank you very much. And I want to sit down, so I hope you can all hear me with this mic. I think what I will say is basically the obvious, but I will say it because sometimes the obvious needs to be repeated. After listening only to this morning's and afternoon session, I think we need to recognize that, setting aside all the aspects of capacity constraints, human, institutional, ultimately, climate change is more politics than it is science. Ultimately. Science is almost treated as a backdrop when you sit in a negotiating room. What we actually deal with is the politics of burden sharing, because that's what the climate change problem is largely related to. So, if we want to tackle this interface between science, policy, and finance, we need to have a paradigm shift in how science relates to policy and vice versa. We need to look at the utility of science to the stakeholders and policymakers as far as the climate change context is concerned. So if it's politics, climate change is more politics than science, then we need to address the question of buy-in. And we've already heard a lot of that coming out through the various interventions from the floor. Buy-in is not about convincing our policymakers that we're vulnerable. I think that's established. We are vulnerable. It's about convincing them to act and to act now, and to demonstrate how we might be able to pursue our actions. That's where the finance part will come in. So if they know we're vulnerable, then your question will be, well, why then are they not taking that leap forward to take the action that we need them to do? We often look at the issue of action versus inaction to demonstrate why they should act. But I do not see more clearly the linkage between action and the benefits as it relates to our national priorities. And this will be different by country, definitely, even though there will be commonalities across the region. So we need to look inward before we look outward. And in that sense, I think with the presentation that we had from the BVI, they did that sort of assessment in determining how they would move things forward. We need to start looking at how we can build finance strategies around our priorities and linking those priorities with the climate action that is needed. Looking inward means looking at what is our finance landscape? What are the finance flows that we have seen within our countries? How they've been directed towards climate-related action? What are the policies that are in place? How have we prioritized spending? We need to look at how this various mix of flows and policies and priorities actually impact upon something that Dr. Bynum mentioned, fiscal space, because in the end, when we're looking at financing, especially in the context of the Caribbean, we need to examine our fiscal space in order to determine what our strategies for financing will look like. Another aspect of that is, having looked at our landscape, determining where we've put our monies, whether those are from domestic or international sources, we then need to look towards, well, do we need to shift policies? Do we need to shift our priorities in spending in order to tap into or leverage opportunities for more financing or more even research opportunities? After doing that, there is a need to look at how we communicate these needs outside. We tend to want to cater our strategies, especially for funding, to our donors. Well, we need to create a way of communicating to them what actually works for us. We do have the big issue of income classification as a threshold for determining the type of finance we get. So in the Caribbean, I think for the most part, many of us are upper middle income countries, so we do not benefit from grant or concessional financing. And there are amongst us, including Antigua and Barbuda, high income countries. That is a significant constraint on a country, looking at the major external shock that they just experienced, to get financing. We need to change the discussion of moving away from income threshold, and we need to focus in on the types of financial instruments that would best address our country context. There is ongoing discussion about changing metrics. Ongoing because I think we've heard the discussion on changing metrics for access to finance or development metrics in general since probably 2002, and there hasn't been much movement to accommodate for us. There have been some exceptions within the World Bank for some small island states to get access to grants based on their vulnerability and capacity to leverage funding. But that's an exception, and that might not hold for very long. So we need to start our own conversation around what can best help us in the context of the multilateral financial institutions. That might not be an easy thing, but certainly it is a conversation that we need to have and we need to bring to the table rather than waiting for the solutions to come to us. So in wrapping up, I would say the gaps that we face largely relate to political buy-in. The second aspect of that would be drawing a connection between climate action and national priorities. And the third aspect would be defining finance strategies that work for us and communicating those strategies outwards. Finance strategies do not necessarily only mean external funding. It can also, and it should include, internal funding. Last point. I wonder, I'm hoping that all of you know about the Sustainable Development Goals. I assume you do. And one goal amongst the 17 goals is actually climate change. It's the primary responsibility of every member state of the United Nations to integrate those goals into their development agendas. In a sense, that movement for mainstreaming has already begun, and we need to see how we can tap into synergies across the development agenda to look for other opportunities to support some of the very issues that we've raised here. With that, I'm going to turn over to Kishan.
Thank you, Janine. And speaking at 5:15 is like a number 11 batsman walking in at the end of a long day. You don't expect him to last long, and I don't intend to disappoint you. Just as a takeoff from Janine's contextualization of financing and the climate change issue at the international level, one of the unfortunate results of the climate change discourse is that it has morphed from an environmental issue at its genesis to a political issue in the contemporary discussions. And once you have politics sort of driving the discussions, finance is automatically an underlying factor that determines what is discussed. And I think Janine already alludes to the issue of burden sharing and what goes with that. But I perhaps would like to bring it down maybe at the national level in terms of speaking to the theme of how do you interface science with policy. And it's not a question that has been asked recently. This is an old question that has had the benefit of many papers, many discussions, few answers, if any at all. But I would probably like to dissect it a little bit down to the bone, maybe, and look at the processes. So having come from a core scientific background and also working in policy development for some time now, I've probably had the benefit of the perspective from both ends. And I've heard and I've been part of, and I've also received complaints that scientists sometimes are at their wits' end to understand why science is not integrated into policy making. So the perhaps logical approach of the scientists of hypothesizing, testing, observing, and concluding is an objective process in scientific methodology. From a policy perspective, there is consultation, there is taking opinions, and all opinions are subjective, and there's no way to test whether they are valid or not, because opinions by nature and by definition are all valid. And how do you now reconcile those opinions that are largely subjective with scientific evidence in the public interest? Because policy formulation is always in the public interest. And that to me is where the dichotomy perhaps begins to revolve around in terms of the processes. So the policymaker who now has to define policy in the public interest has to now balance scientific evidence from an objective sort of perspective with treating with the public interest from a subjective perspective. In the context of climate change, it's easy to argue and it's easy to recognize that, as we all have, I suppose, over time and certainly in the last few days, that climate change is indeed a public interest issue. It can't be otherwise. And Janine's categorization of climate change negotiations as largely political is testimony to the public interest aspect of climate change. But perhaps proffering some solutions or maybe approaches that can bridge the gap, because there is a gap. I think when a policymaker is asked to respond to scientific input or being asked to take scientific input into consideration, one of the things that needs to be asked is, well, what are the needs? What are the policy needs of scientific research? Is the scientific community, I mean, we all sit here, most of us maybe are scientists. This was largely a scientific sort of formatting over the last few days. We've seen a lot of papers being presented, a lot of scientific data, nice graphs and so on. That says to us the obvious and more of what we already know, even if in more detail. But how does that respond to a policy need? How do researchers formulate the research to respond to a policy need? Do researchers know what the policy needs are? Now these are questions that I don't have answers to, so I'm just throwing them out because I suspect that they don't. And similarly, how do policymakers respond to scientific information How do they contextualize that information as it is formatted and as it is messaged into policy needs? So there's a needs versus response dynamic or equilibrium that needs to be addressed in a dynamic way. So perhaps, I mean, for our projects and at the ministry level, we have university participation in the steering committees, for example, and you hear them speak. And they do some of the work that is required for us, and we don't know that they're doing the work. So communication is also a problem. What then defines, or what then would work? What mechanism can work for bridging the policy science interface? I will not speak to finance, because to me finance is the given, is the constant in the equation, the vehicle for transferring policy implementation into on-the-ground reality. But climate change, and I think someone made the point, I think it was Dr. Trotz earlier, that climate change is a national development issue. It is no longer the realm of science and these nice long-term projections and the graphs and so on. It is a national development issue, otherwise we wouldn't be speaking of it here. So then, bridging the policy science interface has to be done, in my view, in a national development context. And therefore, national development priorities, taking a segue from Janine's point, has to inform what science and research will address to respond to the needs of policy in one way. And in the other way, science needs to also offer or to indicate what policy changes can also be effective based on their own knowledge and background. So to me, there has to be a sort of tripartite approach to national development. And it has to involve academia, for sure, but not academia in a silo, because we have universities doing a lot of nice research. You go to symposia and you listen to a lot of esoteric research being done. Nothing is wrong with it, because a university, by definition, should be allowed to do any research at once, because that's the definition of university. But in terms of the national development, there has to be a discussion between academia and research, between government in terms of policy requirements and policy making in the public interest, and of course, a critical part of every economy, the private sector, which is where perhaps much of the financing can be sourced, and who is also involved and who also has research needs. So in my view, there has to be a sort of tripartite discussion, a dynamic one between academia, government, and the private sector, and financial institutions, maybe banks and so on. The other aspect I would probably want to touch upon is the packaging and the messaging. Who is talking to who? Today we have talked to each other, I think, over the past few days. I will probably count myself as one of the few policymakers who are here. But when a policymaker listens to a scientific symposium, what does he take from it? What relevance does it have for him? Is it just a presentation of a scientific paper, again, with wonderful graphs and so on? What is the policy relevance? These are questions that they leave with. The IPCC and advising the UNFCCC at the international level is a case in point, where, and we've had in the last session that debate of negotiating the summary policy for summary makers, the summary for policy makers, SPM, yeah. Negotiating that, and it comes down to negotiation, because then policy makers now try to distill, well, what is policy relevant from the scientific research that is being done. So to me, messaging and packaging the scientific information that can be made palatable to policy relevant contexts, to me is important. So that messaging is important. It goes back, of course, to the needs versus responses and the tripartite. So if then, sustainable funding, research, if these are the answers, then I think we need to play a little bit of a jeopardy, because we have to ask, then what is the question? Because we've heard all the answers, but no one seems to understand, at least not me to a good extent, as to what is the question being asked that all these answers are being addressed to. Again, it comes back to that messaging, needs versus response, and so on. Packaging and contextualizing the national strategies for outward implementation, to me, is key. Taking from Janine's earlier point, that how do we strategize from a financing perspective of what is required? And that is a very difficult thing to do at an international level, far less for a regional level. At a country level, it's even more, it's complex, while it may seem simple, because you have to now drill down at the sectoral level, the cross-sectoral sort of relationships, the interactions, the synergy, their conflicts. How do you reconcile all of that in national prioritizing in the climate change context to now say, we go, okay, this is what we want, or this is what we need, because each country is different. Small islands sometimes are perhaps unfortunately lumped as a group of countries that have similar circumstances. It's not. We have high-income countries in the region. And we know that there, Barbuda, suffering from Irma a few weeks ago, is a case in point. Barbuda was uninhabitable until maybe a few days ago when people started to repatriate from Antigua, if I could use that word. So that sort of disparity, then you have the LDCs being a subset of the SIDS, of the SIDS. And you have on the one hand, you have the South Pacific countries where income is very low, GDP is very low, development is very low, the least developed countries on the one end of the spectrum. And then on the other end, you have places like Singapore. And they're all lumped together. So making the case for international financing, being a donor country, donors will therefore begin to now do that comparison as they have done before. Yeah? And then one of the other things, perhaps finally, because I got a little love note from Mark, to give Roger a chance to speak, is the issue of target implementation, because the culmination of policy formulation, as informed by science, must result in implementation. And how do you implement? Where do you implement? Is the implementation targeted at the beneficiaries that they intended to? Because sometimes you have these project-based approaches, these programmatic approaches. Do we really get the results and the impact of implementation from a policy perspective in the public interest that we have envisioned before? And these are questions that I'm asking. I'm not sure if the answers are necessarily readily available. But perhaps Roger could speak to that as I make my final point.
Thank you. Great. Thanks very much. All right. Good night, everybody. This is an interesting wrap-up, right? So we're asking a different kind of question in this setting. We're asking, how do we reconcile our different values for what we want to achieve? This is beyond the project level. This is beyond what do I fund, and which is how do we address uncertainty. One of the things we want to ask, and the ambassador said it, it's the human mind is amazing. You give us a problem, a complex problem, sooner or later we'll solve it. It's the obvious that takes us forever, right? And the question is, why is that? Because the obvious is about what we value and why. And a lot of what we see so far is a knowledge deficit approach, right? A little bit more information will make us act differently. We know that that's not the case. I do many types of things, from congressional hearings and to other things, as people in the room know. But a hearing, I will tell you, is not a listening. There's a big distinction between the two, no matter who you have at the table. That's the case. So what have we been hearing over the last few days? We can talk, and Mark will have us speak a little bit to some of our experiences on trying to get literature into the IPCC. I was one of the authors of some of it. Kishan and others played a huge role. But what we need to avoid is what I call doing the wrong thing with better information. Answering the wrong question. We have cross-cutting issues. Rehabilitating biodiversity, you've heard a lot of that. Sustainable use of natural resources. Managing threats from waste. And then in that context, the disproportionate impact, as Ken likes to really call it, the existential question about catastrophes in the region. Insurance is not about catastrophe. Everyone thinks that, but it's not. The insurer of last resort is the public. It isn't an insurer. An insurer gets out of business when there's a catastrophe. So let's make a distinction between the operational aspects of risk management and what it takes to manage over time. So where are we in thinking through some of this? In spite of all we know, why do we think that adaptation is so difficult to implement and sustain in practice? What are some of the suggestions? And Mark, you could ask that question and come back to it. So the Financial Times says the perception that adaptation will actually result in economic losses and well-being. It seems like the thing that is trying to save is the reason why we're not implementing it. That was a sample across a whole lot of folks. That in fact, adaptation can be expensive. I work for NOAA. We do a lot of stuff on maritime commerce, on fisheries and sustainability, on weather, climate, and a whole host of other things. But a big part of our role is how does that get into practice? Not just the policy, but the decision-making parts of the issue. So when we say bring more physical and social science into the question, not all social scientists study how we make decisions. Right? Many study how we ought to make decisions, but enough about economists. The idea is let's think through this. What are the right types of finance for the appropriate purpose? Avoiding losses is critical, but considering only avoided losses is not enough. That has not sold anyone on action. We have shown for years that $1 up front, and it's very empirical, $1 up front in reducing risk, land use and otherwise, can save you $4 to $6 when a disaster strikes. What is our experience with implementing such a strategy based on that economic value? It's minimal. So even the economic rationality and our response to it is not as clear as we might think. So we're beginning to get really into why we make certain decisions, because that is the nature of policy. When we ask for improvements in finance, we should ask to answer what question, and we'll get back to some of that. We have not made the case concretely enough that the wider development benefits of climate change adaptation and disaster risk management adds an additional rationale in favor of investments in those areas. We've made the case on avoided losses, but we have not made the case that when you save from an avoided loss, that investment is now part of your portfolio for reducing risk. That's an old statement out of, the World Bank tries to talk about the triple and double dividend and things like that. But the question is who makes those decisions? It yields real returns even in the absence of disasters. It's a richer notion than co-benefits. We've heard, governments can work to leverage the private sector action and investments based on this, right? But it is important to understand the full costs of disasters against which the benefits of these actions we're recommending can be balanced. One of the ways we try to get at this is, in economics, is what is called the sovereign liquidity risk. What is being funded to help us manage the near term, the events that we saw this year, and what is the investment portfolio, and where can we make that happen that gets you a window of opportunity after a disaster? That's the two ends of the sovereign liquidity risk, right? I always like to tell people, yes, there are windows of opportunities, but bad ideas have windows too. We'll be putting things back into place that actually creates future risk. And so a real question from the liquidity standpoint is, there's short-term emergency assistance and response, and there's security and investments in our future, in water, energy, food, disasters. The intervening time scale between those two is actually not well funded. We've done this analysis through the Wilson Center and elsewhere, led a bunch of these with the banks and everywhere. What is missing in terms of the identified area and time frame that meets disaster risk, but also gets us at long-term planning and sustainability. In the back of the minds of everyone, and I don't think Ron is still here. Is Ron Jackson still here? In the room is this. Wow. And I mentioned it in the context of the tale of two Adrians. When we think about the extremes, there's a response and there's a framing. When we think about the long-term, socially constructed risk, there's a different set of answers and framing. The question is, for our region, I don't plan to do this for the world or anywhere else, how best do we articulate the benefit of integrating those efforts, and what are the dividends to the country at hand? I went through an exercise when we were doing the national assessment for the United States, just so we're finishing it over the last few months, of what in the Caribbean, who's doing what in the Caribbean. We have 30 institutions acting at the regional level. Do they talk to each other? We know it's not well coordinated. That's fine. There's a role there. A small sample tells us this. Each of those organizations has differing accountability for reporting on what they're doing. And as a result, that accountability, and this is a policy question, makes a mismatch with meeting the goals of the region from the standpoint of sustainability because of that piecemeal accountability. They're reporting back to the donors. So the donors have some blame in this, right? What are you asking for? Because you're going to get it. And the idea is really what are the barriers and the opportunities? And within that, I'm including my own avenue for how we do our donations through USAID and others, right? What are the barriers and opportunities? The disconnects between donor-driven and country-derived priorities. I'm not reifying the country level. I know we don't always know what we want to do, but we have to uncover what that is. Because that's how you get to a smart versus a best practice. The elephant in the room is making that choice explicit. As everybody in this room knows the story of the 6 blind men and the elephant, right? What is it supposed to represent? 30 institutions, each seeing a part of the problem. But there's a barrier in everybody using the same model. Polwardy's corollary to that is 6 blind elephants will conclude that a human being is flat. We will have the same approach, we'll be coordinated, but our results will be negative. Right? So what is the trade-off between the overlapping responsibilities of all of those organizations in the room, and how do we get to it? So just to wrap up, I'm not wrapping up, Mark feels good when you say that. Yeah. We have to explore and understand the resilience definition and the dividend of what saving on adaptation, as a result of the savings on adaptation, helps you invest for long-term risk management. There's a big issue here in determining where the benefits might be most significant in climate risk. And the only way we get to that is something George was talking about, being able to foster a climate risk management fiscal strategy at the country level in which we identify what is needed and who will do what in monitoring and forecasting, in risk assessment, in embedding in planning and preparedness, and then evaluating that process. And from the other regional institutions, how are our climate information services supporting each of those items at the country level? That's a pragmatic, very practical effort that then feeds back into how we understand the dividends. But we have to address the funding paradoxes of things like donor-driven versus country-derived, and disaster risk reduction versus climate adaptation. For a region, if we don't overcome that and we constantly think, oh, there are 2 funding streams here and there's no reconciling them, then we do what Picasso said years ago is the problem with universities. The world has problems and universities have departments. The problem is then we keep the separation to align our funding, and we do not answer the fundamental questions that society is facing in our region. So we want to link the climate change agenda and disaster risk management. And there are issues such as additionality that people know in this room, that if we don't integrate these 2 pieces together, what additionality is, wow, there's money for development, and anything beyond that, such as climate, is additional. Well, if that is not part of development, as Kishan is saying, then all we're doing is saying, you're out there, 100 feet out, and you're drowning, here's 50 feet of that rope. You should get the other 50 from somewhere else. And so we have to get past this. And when I say we have to get past it, what I'm mentioning in terms of the risk dividend and in terms of risk management framework are mechanisms by which we get past it, not a set of oughts about what we ought to do. Anybody could say that. I've sat on enough National Academy reports that say that. So what is the definition of the problem, and how do we create a national risk management framework that then is informed by the regional agencies across this disaster risk to climate adaptation timeframe. Basic and applied research is necessary, but more than that is decision-making research, how we make decisions, which values are being affected, and how choices are being made, because it is about our values. It's not about the science, it's not about how much of the resources we have, but it is about what we want and choose to do with it as a region.
Okay, I will stand for this for the remainder of the session. So you've heard from the three panelists, and we hope now that we can open up for a few discussions and questions. But having had the opportunity of the chair, I will exercise my prerogative by first asking a few of my own. So, Ambassador, you mentioned the whole issue of insufficient political buy-in, as well as the need to relate programs to national strategies. I do know we are very good at preparing strategies in this region. And it seems like every time a new administration comes in, we have a new strategy. The question is, how do we move from strategies to action? And what's precluding us from having greater political buy-in? Kishan, you mentioned the whole issue of us seeking to get the private sector involved in the Caribbean region, particularly for climate resilience building. One of the major challenges we have where adaptation is concerned is how do we get the private sector to finance adaptation initiatives, given the public good nature of many of these. And lastly, to my erudite friend, Roger, how do we translate a lot of these risk management issues into sound policy, as well as getting the private sector, and particularly our financial institutions on side, not only to know the risk, but to take them into their own decision-making. So, I don't know, I think they say ladies before gents, so.
Yeah, I don't usually follow these dictates, but anyways, I will come from a very biased position because I think we have turned a corner on the development exercise that we've been very used to, which is more of a short-term approach to development, and we've now adopted an agenda, a sustainable development agenda, that takes that attempts to take a longer view of issues, and so I'm speaking largely from my experience with having negotiated a 2030 agenda, and what exactly that means. I'm coming to your question of political buy-in, the insufficiency of political buy-in, and what I was hoping to convey was that we, from the policymakers' perspective, going back to what Roger was speaking to, we don't necessarily take the science and make it a part of our decision-making process, which is problematic, which has been problematic, and the focus of more of a long-term view of the development agenda and integrating climate change into that development agenda, which would necessarily have the main priorities of a country, would, in my view, help to bring that political buy-in. So it is a biased view because I'm taking the point that we're departing from a larger global agenda that already sees climate change as an important part of development, and bringing that down to the level of the country where we have to integrate these things, climate change in particular, into that development agenda. And so the science would necessarily have to inform the values, the national priorities in the context of that national planning strategy. I think that longer view that we're aiming for through this new development exercise potentially will address the concerns for dealing with the short-termism of political cycles. I think the one last point, which is critical, is that there is an expectation within the context of this 2030 agenda that each country will be defining a finance package basically for how they will go about implementing the agenda. And we're at very early stages. We've heard from maybe 65 countries on how they're going about attempting to do this. A lot of it is focused on domestic resource mobilization. A lot of it is. But there is obviously a need for external support. There's a framework for dealing with external support also that accompanies this 2030 agenda. And in principle, we have multilateral institutions, the MDBs in particular, who are committed to aligning their portfolios basically with supporting the 2030 agenda and the climate change agenda inclusive. So there are opportunities potentially to tap into. There's a recognition that the old model of who gets what might not work. I understand that at a meeting in Brussels of the African, Caribbean, Pacific states and the OECD, there was a briefing from the OECD pointing to the recognition that small island developing states are vulnerable because of their various endemic qualities, and that the financing structure for sustainable development will have to respond to those. And so there is thinking outside of the box occurring. So I'll leave it at that. I think we've turned a corner for a more long-term approach to development. It is a more integrated approach, so we have the climate change there. At the country level, when we start integrating, that's where we bring together all the pieces, the science, the policymakers, but addressing national priorities. And the financing will have to come from various sources, not just external. Domestic resource mobilization is critical, but we can try to push as far as possible the discussion that's occurring outside in terms of how the external support can best address SIDS context. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I answer the question, Mark, maybe I just want to address one point that Janine made and just pick it on how can science inform decision making. Right. In the past few weeks, we have seen, and in this region in particular, we have seen that in action. All you get, and maybe addressing Glenda's point earlier, all governments need to know is that there is an extreme event on the horizon and it's likely to hit them. And all decision making then relies on science, because that is where the Met Services are now in constant contact and giving scientific advice for policy and decision making to governments. But the reason is obvious, because there's a huge amount at stake. There's a lot of loss to be realized. We've just seen it in action in the past few weeks. The question is now, how do you translate that paradigm into the long-term context of climate change impacts? I don't have the answer, I'm just saying. But we have examples of science informing policy and decision-making for extreme events. It happens all the time. Okay, so how do we get private sector to finance adaptation? I would love to answer that if I was from the private sector. But I'm not. But I can give you the perspective that and the experiences I've had with the private sector and businesses. And I know for a fact that they're not in the business of altruism, nor charity. And so they will not finance anything that does not have a vested interest for them. And I've had this discussion with our own private sector here. And the response I've gotten invariably is you put it into law and we will find the money to comply, because then it's a justification. So one way of getting private sector to respond is through, well, it's a word that's very unpopular these days in Trinidad, and it's called tax. It's called taxes, and carbon taxes are well known. And how you treat with the proceeds from climate change taxes is one way of getting private sector to contribute to financing, but that is at the sort of the national government level. But if you go and you ask someone to fund adaptation, it's not going to happen, especially private sector. But adaptation in itself also has various sort of tiers. You have the community level, you have the sectoral and the multi-sectoral and the cross-sectoral level. Then you have the national level. One way of addressing perhaps those sort of sub-tiers of adaptation is through corporate social responsibility. By private sector showing their social responsibility to the communities, at the community level at least, to communities that support them and in which they operate. So, and that has worked in some instances right here in Trinidad and Tobago, and in fact we have a CSR expert in the room who may wish to come in at some point, and she's at the back, who has done a lot of work on corporate social responsibility. But that is another way of addressing adaptation or raising finance for adaptation at the community level. Whether that will work at the national or other higher tiers, I'm doubtful. But there are some ways that you can get or raise financing from the private sector to look at national development issues. And adaptation is a national development issue, as is climate change, because adaptation is just a part of that equation. You know, altruism and charity are not the sort of guiding principles of business. That we know. So other sort of innovative approaches to get them to act, to get them to pay, CSR or through taxes or otherwise, some of the ways that can work. And in Trinidad and Tobago, we also have what is called the Green Fund, not the Green Climate Fund. The Green Fund that is capitalized through proceeds of a tax on all profits from businesses, and which is used for financing environmental work, which can include climate change.
Yeah. Okay. As well. So let's try to get at some. I mean, the things you've heard are exactly some of the issues we've talked about relative to private financing, right? Things like working through green bonds and social responsibility, which is probably the biggest driver, is what do you value and how do you look to the public? And we hear a lot about P3s, public-private partnerships and so on. But one of the things we have to ask, which problem is being solved? How is the public good being answered by that question? From the standpoint of how we talk about the role of science in planning and management, I can only speak from experience in terms of trying to get things done and then having them supported by people who were very anti-climate change agenda and so on, who actually support the issue. No institution, however well designed, is independent of the individuals within those institutions. One of the biggest successes I think the 5Cs and others have had is developing the cadre of professionals around the regions through UE and elsewhere. Why am I saying this? It's because the only people that someone really listens to in terms of informing their action are the people that guide their thinking, those who work for them. Not a scientist coming in and lecturing him or her about what they ought to do. How we've done this in different parts of the world is basically work very, very much on the issue specifics. Not coming in and saying climate change has all of these issues that you must somehow respond to. The issue is finding the individuals in policy, in politics, and in business who has defined a particular area as something that they're interested in. And then you work with them on that. If we walk in and say all things under the sun, then we'd find ourselves where we are with vulnerability. Sure, social vulnerability. We've known risk is socially constructed for 40 years now. How are our actions commensurate with knowing that? Not great. even though we've known that. And so the issue is really finding what the individual interest is as an entry point. I work with people who worry about wildfires, as you know is happening right now. So we work with them on that. From a policy standpoint, all things cannot be handled at the same time. We have to find those who in government and in the private sector, and I'm not saying this is a dream, this is how we actually work. And we work with those folks on how to get their agenda and what the science is to inform their agenda. Okay. Without that individual task, then we're asking for all answers to be answered at once. And then it gets conflated with all of development, it gets conflated with all of socially constructed risk, and it gets conflated with all of adaptive management. And so what we ask is, where are those specific outcomes from a risk standpoint that we can help you with? And then you show them you can help, because that opens the... How do we learn? We actually know, or we ask someone else. We look to whoever else has done it. And you create those examples that are beyond the pilot, but actually working with folks in policy on a specific issue of their interest. Somebody makes hurricanes their issue, okay, we're going to help you with that. But it's not everything under the sun in terms of environmental risk.
Good.
And that's actually has an empirical record behind doing it.
All right. Good. We have roughly 10 minutes more, so we'll open up for a few questions. And we'd ask that the responses also be a bit short so we can have a few more. Yes, I have 1, 2. So, Jethro. Who has the mic? Oh. Then let him go ahead. The Dr. Hospital, let's go ahead. Fine. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks to the panel. I enjoyed the presentation, and just things that caught me were the utility of the science to the stakeholders. And I want to come back to that, which Janine started off on. It's all about politics, the fiscal space. And Kishan, you mentioned about, everything should be in the public interest, should be. And winners and losers, you talked about synergies and conflicts. You then use winners and losers, but we don't maybe talk about it enough. And the values, and isn't it that most people value, we want everything and we want it now. That's what we value most of all. We're not willing to wait, we're not willing to prevent, we want it all and we want it now. All the KFC, all the oil, everything. But where does that bring us back then in terms of the utility of science to stakeholders? And I can't help think how much in public health we're struggling the same way. So when I came to join CARFA 5 years ago and I found I had a science board, the first body I appointed the board is a political scientist. Because his scholarship is under what conditions do political leaders keep their commitments? That sounds like scholarship we need more of. Under what conditions do political leaders keep their commitments? And that's John Curtin, the head of the G8 and G20 research unit. But in our experience and sharing, we've had to do that in public health and not talk about improved quality and competitiveness of tourism. The private sector, protecting your people, your image, and your investment. Not about preventing disease. Of course, the modality is preventing disease. It's about removing preventable impediments to economic growth. It's about heritage cuisine, because somebody's interested in heritage cuisine. It's about consumer safety, and so on and so on. So finding the hooks in the other sectors, which are here, we're trying to do the same thing here, that's going to speak to that other audience, that they're going to take some action now that's going to advance the climate agenda. I remember speaking to hoteliers for years about diarrheal disease in the industry. They used to call me Dr. Diarrhea. It wasn't until Luther Miller, the financial controller of CTO, said, James, you had to change the message and speak about improving profitability through attention to health and hygiene. But those two first words hooks a private sector person every time. You got something to say about improving profitability? So I think if we can learn from other experiences, and we're not the only ones, others as well, but I'm just sharing those, that those are partly where we need to go to convince them to act and to act now, and also to show where the money might be. Where is the fiscal space? So we're trying to get a meeting of our finance ministers on economic dimensions of health, and particularly NCDs. And our lead PM for health is championing this, Timothy Harris. He's a money man. So if we can get him persuaded, then maybe we'll have some traction. But I don't want to hog the floor. Others want to ask questions.
Thank you. The young lady at the back, please.
Hi. Hi, good evening. Marcia Tinto from the Environmental Management Authority here in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm trying to be as concise as possible because I have a number of things that I wanted to raise. But first of all, I want to commend the 5Cs for, an excellent conference, and also their partners, the EU, the UN agencies, and all those who have worked so hard to bring this to fruition. So thank you very much. Over the last 3 days, I've heard a lot about information sharing and research and all the things that we are grappling with. And many speakers talked about information, awareness building, capacity building. And I just wanted to bring to the fore the fact that the UNFCCC, everybody here I'm sure knows about Article 6, which deals with education, awareness and training. As an environmental educator, so I'm outnumbered here, we have to interpret the science for the public. And the decision makers, mind you, are not just the politicians. They're also anyone involved in making decisions, basically the farmers, the educators like ourselves, the business sector, as Kishan mentioned. I'd like to take the opportunity too, as well, to congratulate the pioneers, the stalwarts, because we've been involved in this since the late 90s. Dr. Trotz, Dr. Leslie, Kishan, Dr. Pulwarti. I see also, I want to recognize Dale Rankin. We actually were involved in doing a manual, a handbook for Caribbean journalists back in 2004. Wesley Gibbons, who's not here with us today, but he was also very instrumental, as well as Judy Clark, who I think is still here. So these are people who have been working on climate change, bringing climate change to the agenda since, well, I'm not very good at math, but since the late 90s. And I'm still disturbed because there is a lot of talk about education and awareness, which is not just going to the schools and the tertiary education, but this is how adaptation comes about, by convincing people, by ensuring that they have the knowledge, and then we help them with the tools so that they can do things better. And I find that there is a lot of ad hoc, very piecemeal approaches to education on climate change in the region. And I'm hoping this is something the 5Cs can help us with, because in the good old days, sorry, not that these days are good, not good, when we had the MAC project, there was a lot of work being done on public education and training and awareness. And as I said, it's very disjointed now. So I'm just calling upon, the 5Cs to probably put that on the agenda, to take a look at it and see how best we can work together, and so that we won't have this kind of ad hoc approach where we are 20 years later and still talking about the fact that we need information sharing and public awareness in the region. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting comments by the panel. I will start with Ambassador Felsen first. I'm happy that you raised some issues I raised yesterday as well when I took the floor in terms of financing and the issue of the DAC committee of the OECD and the issue of per capita GDP. As you know, we were not successful in getting that change in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development, nor the 2030 Development Agenda. I would like to prescribe that we continue to lobby the relevant authorities in our countries to ensure that our negotiators continue to call on those responsible for this obsolete means of assessing development and the provision of aid to come up with a different formula besides per capita GDP. Kishan mentioned the question of packaging and messaging. I think that's very important. This morning I commended Dr. Hospitalis on his presentation in terms of the effects of climate change and health. Coming out of this successful conference, I must thank the EU for calling me a few nights ago, inviting me to this conference. How are we going to ensure that what Dr. Hospitalis said, for example, gets to the man, the woman, the child on the street, to let them know that climate change is a clear and present danger to their health? Are we going to just do the reports and the academics, the scientists, the diplomats, and so on, the policymakers and the ministries, they alone get it? What are we going to do? So that is why I hope coming out of this meeting, the packaging and messaging that Kishan spoke about in relation to what could be seen as low-hanging fruit are really low-hanging fruit, so the average man on the street could relate to it. Thank you.
Yes, Jethro Green, the Caribbean Farmers Network. Just a quick suggestion. Isn't it time that I've been looking at the staffing of 5Cs? Isn't it time that we look at setting up a unit of 5Cs at CARICOM in strengthening 5Cs, setting up a unit of 5Cs at CARICOM that would deal with things like research results, coordination, information sharing and training, etc. like that. Because what I'm saying, the task that you have accomplished, being based in Belize and at the same time with a limited staff, I'm thinking that we should think practically, all right? That we should have, because why I say CARICOM, because at the CARICOM head office, that's where all the offices are. They're not dispersed. So if we have that unit set up there, it would tie in better to looking at coordination of policy, research results, and information sharing. Because what I think I've seen coming out of all this meeting is that we have done a lot of work within the region, but we don't know how to sell ourselves, and sometimes we underestimate ourselves. And it is time for coordination and focus. And I think that we need a small unit to do that. And I show that there would be no problem getting the funds to set that up.
Yeah. I would, on that note, I would ask my three panelists to respond. I'll take that last question, however. That one is beyond the panelists, I'm sure. It's even beyond me, but my executive director is here. But I don't know if you wish to quickly respond to anything you heard. Just quickly, a minute or so.
So one of the things I want to keep in mind, because we hear a lot about communication and packaging, which is critical. But let's be honest, from what you heard from Adrian, what you heard from George, what you heard from a whole slew of folks, is that the actions that lead to human risk are not simply amenable to better communication, because they're fundamental to the choices that we make. It's not simply that we're not communicated to, we don't see ourselves, one, as a society in the Caribbean, able to make those changes, and two, that in fact, the drivers of those risks are external to our actions. That's how we see it. So as a result, communication by itself is extremely important, yes. However, the things that lead to human insecurity are behavioral, cognitive, and values-based. We know that to be true. And we only get at that when people think we are working with them, for them. There's an old African proverb, if you do something for me without me, it is against me. And I want to make sure that we're not simply saying that if we communicate better, realization occurs. I know Kishan doesn't mean that either. I'm just making sure that we in the room are clear that all of the things that you heard today is how risk and is constructed, but how also opportunities are constructed. And it's beyond communication.
Thank you. Yes, ditto. The issue of communication and actual, how that links public awareness, public education, how does that link, or rather education, how does that link with behavioral change is something that remains a challenge. Dr. Hospitalis spoke about wanting things now. That is human nature. You can't change that by mere education or more communicating the facts. It's how do you instill behavioral change? The consequences of promiscuity and STDs, for example, are well known. Does it really change behavior? You don't have to answer. But it's a case in point where there's no direct linearity between education, communication, and behavioral change, because you're dealing with complex organisms called human beings. And I think that is where the challenge lies in terms of, again, coming back to the packaging and messaging.
Yeah, just on that, it really boils down to, well, how it matters to me in a lot of ways. On how the science actually can work better for policymakers, stakeholders. I totally agree with the point made that it's not just the policymakers. Obviously, we're speaking from the granular right up. And I think it's important that we don't think of science as a sledgehammer. This is what you have to do. But could we think of it more as a prism through which we look at our national priorities and objectives? Is it something that it's a lens to see where we want to go and how it might be able to assist us in getting there? And I think that's partly, maybe there's a distinction that has to be made between the value and the expectations of scientific research versus maybe scientific understanding. And perhaps when we're talking about what we use for communicating, we're really talking about translating scientific understanding and not necessarily discrediting the importance of scientific research as something separate. I don't know if that's just my naive view, because I'm not a scientist, but I'm wondering if perhaps there is a distinction there that needs to be made. I think also, the focus is largely on the country level, because that's where we need to really kind of get our act together, if I could be frank. But we do have, at the regional level, we have the 5 Cs, of course. We also have these quasi-cabinet for the CARICOM, and we have identified, we have a Prime Minister who deals with the health issues, NCDs, and we also have a portfolio for sustainable development. And I think there is a lot of benefit from having your leaders go to, let's say, the World Bank meetings that occur and speaking to the issues that are of interest, telling our stories, using whatever script we can manifest for our particularities when it comes to the challenges we face. And yes, they do. I mean, I've written many statements that address that, but it's actually not just diagnosing the problem, it's also coming up with a solution. And that is a critical thing for our politicians to go to the meetings with. It's easy to gripe, very easy to gripe, but it's much harder to give a window for possible action to address those gripes. Thank you.
Thank you, and I just want to say thanks to my panelists, Roger, Kishan, Ambassador. But if you allow me, just before you put your hands together, allow me 1 minute. Because I'm not going to try to pre-see what they said. But I think I must make a plug before I leave the podium, and that is, the last 3 days would have been a waste of time if we leave here and we keep just talking about these issues. I trust that come tomorrow and going forward, we can frame different programs and concrete actions to address some of these. I can't promise you we can address them all in one program or one project. Neither can I promise you that this will only be an action to be taken from the 5 Cs. We have heard what the issues are. The ball now is in our court to take this forward. I can assure you the PDMU at the 5 Cs will be looking to advance programs, and tomorrow at the discussion at the EU GCCA, we are coming to hear how much of the 300 million you said you have, if we can get... I know, I'm just kidding. we can take from that, okay? So ultimately, this would not just have been a talk shop, but the next time we come, we can say, well, we've actually checked off, and we have achieved this, that, or the other. So thanks again, panelists. Now we can put our hands together.
Thanks, Mark, for those very encouraging remarks and maybe engagement by the 5C in the near future. We'll like to hear that the conference not been a waste of time. And now we are to the final session of the 3 days, which include another hour of discussion and 5 presentations. So I hope you have enough coffee. No, it's true. We actually have 5 sessions, so I hope we are ready to take now. Okay, we're going to the closing remarks and the way forward. Thanks for sticking out to us, and we have about now 10 minutes to have just the formal closing. And we are, from my side, I have 3 announcements and then some thank you. So bear with me for 1 minute. I would like to make sure that whoever is present here signs their name at the front desk and also leaves their email address, because with their email address you will receive every presentation. If you don't have your email address, you won't receive the material, so it's very important. Tomorrow, I just want to tell you that the invitation is open to everybody to come to listen to about the EU GCCA Plus initiative, so we welcome you, everybody, from 9 to 1, so hopefully we see you there. It will be a quite an engaging discussion, because we have it set up in a way that we can have a good interaction during those 4 hours. One more announcement is that tomorrow at 6 p.m., there is yet another compulsory and mandatory reception. So it's a good thing at the Savannah Terrace, which is a terrace kind of next to the sushi bar. Anyway, on close where we did the other reception, you will find it. It's called Savannah Terrace, 6 o'clock tomorrow night, so please be there. It will be a really good opportunity to say bye and socialize, so 6 p.m. And finally, before I call the final presenter for our closing remark, from my side, our side, I would like to thank you, few people that made this possible. Of course, the 5C teams, which the GCA facility worked hard in the last few months to make this possible, also the days before this conference. So thanks Zaidi, thanks Alison, thanks Alisa, thanks all your team, and really appreciate your collaboration. Thanks to Christophe, the team leader of GCA facility, for making this possible. Great commitment. I will also thanks to our sponsor, as always. Try to remember those, because without the financial commitment we won't have this conference. So the sponsor over there, I won't go through the list, but thanks to the sponsor. And finally, thanks to you for being present and sticking with us in these 3 days and having some great discussion and some points that we're taking on. So that was my speech, which I'm glad. And now I'll invite 3 people which will give us some closing remarks. Please, Sharon, would you like to come to the desk? Also, Mr. Kisha, hopefully he didn't get out, hopefully still here. Yes, please. Thank you so much. And Dr. Trotz, please. So, Mr. Sharon, Mr. Mike, I'm so tired, sorry. Mr. You can kill me. Mrs. Sharon. Miss, okay, now you just, I'm out. Miss Sharon is going to give us some remarks about the way forward for stakeholder engagement, while Mr. Kishma Kurunda will give us some closing remarks, and finally we will have the vote of thanks from Dr. Trotz. So, Miss Sharon, it's all yours.
I don't think Dr. Bino put that mic all the way up there. Somebody else. This closing is going to be a little longer than the 5 minutes, Tenny. So, when I saw on the agenda, maybe Friday, that Dr. Trotz, the ultimate culprit, had put me on the agenda to do the way forward for stakeholder engagement, honestly, I was a bit intimidated. How do you bring together all these people in this room and plan a way forward for continuous engagement for the ultimate benefit of the region? So I had a few discussions with persons around the room. I've listened as much as I can. And let's see. So if we could start with where we are and where we want to go as a region. Well, we know a few things. We know we are doing a lot of good work. It's science-based work. There's no fake news here. We have money, many best practices. Our MPAs, for instance, already engage scientists and practitioners, and we can learn from that. Our story is urgent. Our reality is all too real. Our ECLEC colleague quoted the cost of Irma and Maria at $400 billion. That doesn't include when we begin to add other things like drought conditions and all our other challenges. So broadly, I see 3 areas that we can advance on. Communication is key. It's not useful for us to know, the world needs to know. We have to tailor a message for the end user. The message to the negotiator is not the same as the one to the farmer. It's not the same as the one to the policymaker. We need to engage stakeholders outside our normal realm. Do we talk to each other a little bit too much already? We need to meet people where they are. We're all doing good work in our individual fields, and we need to enhance our networking and collaboration. The rationale for this conference, for instance. Specifically, there's really a role for all of us. It's a process, and it operates as a circle, each influencing each other. We need additional resources to disseminate our tools, and while Sea Coral has been successful in its reach, the others are not so endowed. We need to incorporate risk management into decision making, and these tools really help that process. There are a few private sector persons here with us, maybe gone by now, but we need to engage the professionals. We need to engage the bankers, the consulting firms, the professionals, and the persons that are at the front line of what's happening in our countries. For instance, we need to engage our development banks to begin to partner with us more in climate finance, to begin to fund that retrofitting and resilience building that we need to do. We're quite pleased to be joined the last few days by 2 very young climate trackers, young journalists writing about climate change. But that's really not enough. We need to engage the people who decide media policy, those who decide what's news and what's fake news. Someone said that we cannot blame our leaders for the decisions that they take. And perhaps that's true. Perhaps we need to enhance our approach and engage parliamentarians. Let's try that instead. Natural scientists in this room probably outnumber the social scientists. The discussions need to be had with those that advise on macro policy and those that focus on the society as a whole. We need a more holistic approach at the discussions. We're a single Caribbean basin. Our overseas territories are as much a part of the Caribbean as the rest of us. Our challenges are shared. Can we begin to talk about how to channel climate finance to those territories too? Our institutions need support. Capacity building, capacity building, capacity building. I think we finally need to figure out how we truly get to some capacity building. We would also like to encourage a strengthening of donor coordination. When we talk about ensuring coordination to maximize resources, that really means all of us. One of our most engaged participants, Mr. Jethro, has been from civil society. And just this afternoon, we heard again about the need to involve them meaningfully. These are the people in the societies that we want to support. I personally think we've had a remarkable few days. And some persons have remarked that we should continue to host conferences similar to this one. And we think so too. Perhaps biennially, Dr. Leslie, Dr. Trott said that. And definitely through a network of regional organizations. We just need to find the financial support. 5Cs has supported and will continue to support the research agenda. The impact project that Adele presented earlier will establish a network of researchers, and that will be our first attempt at doing that. So it's our societies, it's our livelihoods, it's our lives. We should be deciding our response. The conference is step 1, phase 1, one avenue. That's all I have to say. It's been great. Thank you.
Well, Mike, thanks so much, Sharon, for this positive conclusion. And I would like to invite to the podium for the closing remark, Mr. Kishan Kulman Singh. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, and I think it's a good time to say good evening before I say good night. Well, Mark stole some of my remarks, and I don't know where he got it from, but just to say that I endorse that, and just to add that, that indeed the last 3 days, as Sharon said, was quite enlightening. I mean, we had loads and tons of knowledge being disseminated. And of course, the next steps are critical in terms of putting this knowledge and this information to use, because knowledge hoarded is knowledge wasted, as the well-known adage says. So therefore, we look forward to learning more of the GCCA Plus initiative that is coming our way. Regional approaches have proven in our instance to be quite useful. We've, I think Marcia had earlier alluded to MAC and the AC and the CPAC. So we have been getting our acts together over some time now. But at the same time, it is critical that what we've learned here is that notwithstanding regional approaches, that national circumstances are critical if the regional approach is to be successful. And therefore, I would urge that countries be engaged in a very granular level to understand what their needs are in formulating any regional approach, because again, that is the key to success. I heard someone mention of the 300 million, I don't know if it's US, euros, or pounds, or Trinidad and Tobago dollars, but notwithstanding, it's a sizable amount of money. I just would want to just signal there's a lot of financing out there. We're hearing a lot of funding initiatives taking place. And sometimes problems are not solved merely by throwing money at it. We know that. So I would probably maybe counsel that, you know, instead of formulating, and again, it hinges on my earlier point, that engaging countries at a granular level to maximize the amount of financing that is being made available under this GCCA Plus program needs to be taken, you know, soberly into account. Because if the regional approach has to be successful, again, country involvement at inception and at a very granular level really is the key ingredient for success. So while we have this sort of financing available, I think this conference has added a lot of value in terms of the knowledge that has been disseminated that can now go into programming regional approaches that can emanate from the GCCA Plus programming. And perhaps I could, in advance, thank the EU. I know Dr. Trotz will be thanking everyone, but let me, for my own part and on behalf of the ministry, I would like to thank the 5Cs and all the sponsors for hosting this important conference here in Port of Spain. We look forward to the deliberations tomorrow and what comes out of the programming of the GCCA Plus, and to thank the donors in advance of making the funds available so that we can advance the climate change agenda that is so critical to small and developing states here and low-lying states here in the region. With that said, then, it's now time to say good night, and I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kumar Singh, for those remarks, and reminder that maybe money is not always the answer. Having said that, we would like to have Dr. Trotz to give a vote of thanks and concluding remarks. Dr. Trotz, podium is yours.
Thank you,
if I were in good voice, I would have started this with a line from My Way, and now the end is near. Anyway, it's my pleasure really to say thanks to everybody who combined their efforts to make this event the success that I think it was. First, let me thank our sponsors, EU CDB, our silent partner, UNDP JCCCP program FAO, and particularly to our colleagues from the EU. I remember when we first negotiated this with you, the face of the center was Otis Jocelyn. And over the year, with a constant sort of exchange between Guido and Christophe, with Otis, and latterly with Daniel, we felt that Guido and Christophe were part of the Climate Change Center. But we do appreciate the effort. We do appreciate your sort of insistence that we make every sacrifice to ensure that this was a quality event. And I think it has been. So thanks, and we look forward to working with your team in the future as we move ahead. I'd also like to say a special thanks to our dignitaries who graced our opening session. DSG Dr. Slater from CARICOM, our colleague from the EU that's here in Trinidad and Tobago, Mrs. Natasha Helena Zurich, to the Executive Director of ECLAC, Dan Corliss, and our own dignitary, Dr. Leslie, who I am so glad that we were able to encourage him not only to participate in this part of the activity, but in the actual program. And we are also delighted to see that we are able to keep our executive director within our sites for the last 3 days. A special thanks to him also for giving us the confidence to press forward when there was a period there when we were wavering, and for his support to get us to this stage. I'd like to say thanks to our institutions. And the reason was that at the very beginning, when we had this concept, we contacted them. UE, CARDI, CARFA, CIMH, ECLAC, and they all basically gave us a very positive response. Indeed, the senior member of some of our institutions, I particularly think of Professor Taylor, Professor Agard, and Dr. Nurse. None of them are here, and yet we had this exceptional event. And the reason was that they committed their institutions to be a part of this event. The result is that we had a set of presenters over the last few days, which I am very happy to say is the new face, basically, of climate science research across the region. And I'm very confident that climate research is now in very capable, youthful hands. And to our presenters, all those presenters, thank you very much for your effort. The quality of the presentations basically bears evidence to the fact that there was a lot of effort put into its preparation, and we thank you for that dedication. To our session chairs, our moderators, thanks. Without you, we would not have been able to have such an ordered sort of meeting. Next, I'd like to say thanks to our participants. I thank them for their endurance, for their sort of engagement, and the fact that they lent quite a lot to the quality of our deliberations over the last 3 days. I think we've taken note of some of the comments coming from the floor, and the next event that we have, I think we will ensure that after the discussion of the science, etc., we have a special session where we have all of our key stakeholders, policymakers, civil society, etc., to have that discussion, to make sure that we pass on information to them, but even much more important, that we get a feedback from them that what we're doing is relevant, and if it's not, what courses we should take. I now come to say thanks to, of course, the management of the hotel for the excellent facilities that were provided, to our IT team that made sure that we proceeded over the last few days with as few glitches as possible. And finally, thanks to my colleagues from the Climate Change Center. Particular thanks to Otis Jocelyn, who unfortunately, due to illness, is not able to be here to see the success, basically, that has resulted, that we have achieved as a result of the tremendous efforts that he had put into this event. To Daniel, and Zedi, my other two colleagues, because as we approached the tape, they were basically very much a part of the everyday activity. And of course, to Alison, the Secretariat, Alison, Alicia, Ashanti, Sharon, all of those people, all of my colleagues, who really put their shoulder to the wheel to make sure that we got here and that we got here successfully. Even back in our office, some of our staff members who were not here, every single one made a contribution to the success of this event. As one of my poets said, all are involved, and I can assure you, all of us were consumed with the effort of getting us to this event. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm very pleased, very tired, but very pleased with this event. And my final thanks is a thanks in anticipation to our EU partners for the support for the next climate change conference in the Caribbean. Thanks.
You are free. Thank you so much.